Katherine Knight is an Australian murderer and the first woman in the country to be sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison. She was a domestic abuser who emotionally, physically, and psychologically victimised all of her partners, and our last victim, John Price, was subject to violence and threats of murder before his horrific death. In the early hours of the 1st of March 2000, Katherine Knight stabbed John Price to death, skinned and butchered him, cooked his body parts, with her intending to feed them to his children. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Katherine Mary Knight was born on the 24th of October 1955 in the town of Tenterfield in New South Wales in the southeast of Australia. She was born into an extremely dysfunctional household, characterised by serious violence, alcohol abuse, adulterous behaviour, and exposure to issues that no child should have to see. Specifically, Knight's father, Ken Knight, was a violent alcoholic who would rape Barbara, her mother, up to 10 times a day. He would also violently assault her. Barbara, in turn, often told her daughters intimate details of her sex life and how much she hated having sex with men. Later, when Knight herself complained to her mother that one of her partners wanted her to take part in a sex act she did not want to perform, Barbara told her to, quote, "put up with it and stop complaining." Knight also stated that, from early childhood until she was around 11 years old, she was sexually abused by various male members of the family. This appears to have been widely known, but no one did anything to stop it. While psychopaths tend to embellish stories about their childhood, Knight's claims have been supported by her siblings, who also had to endure this brutal upbringing. As with other children who grow up in similar environments, being exposed to horrific behaviour and having no escape and no one to talk to, Knight internalised everything and was described as a quiet, withdrawn girl who had few friends and tended to keep to herself. There seemed to be two sides of Knight. The first was a model student who got awards for her good behaviour. The other was a bully who had extreme bouts of explosive rage, who would victimise younger children, particularly boys, and would often get into physical fights and attack people with weapons. On one occasion, a teacher had to fend off an attack from her. No doubt these outbursts were a tiny reflection of unresolved trauma she had experienced from watching and being the victim of acts of abuse, and her actions were an indicator of how her early years had shaped her attitudes and beliefs, with her perceiving that violence was a way to dominate and control others. Relationships were not partnerships, but a power struggle, and that men were to be hated and deserved to be abused. Knight left school illiterate and began working as a cloth cutter in a clothing factory. However, she soon found a profession which she described as her, quote, dream job. This was working as a local abattoir, where she began by cutting up bits of offal to then being trained as a butcher. She was extremely skilled in this work and seemed to have a passion for it. However, she seemed to take a morbid fascination in her work and would often stand watching while the pigs came through the production line and were killed. She had a set of professional butcher's knives for work, and she would hang these above her bed everywhere she lived, all through the years that she was free. This must have looked terrifying for someone who wasn't expecting it, walking into a room and seeing the bed adorned with huge knives, capable of slicing through flesh and bone. As she grew up, Knight's violent behaviour became more frequent and serious, and she would often get into bar fights and even stir up trouble in order to get into physical altercations. She would also frequently suggest knife fights with people that upset her and generally seemed to revel in extreme violence. If Knight's violence towards others wasn't bad enough, her behaviour towards the men that she was in a relationship with was nothing short of sadistic. One of the men that Katherine Knight began a relationship with was David Stanford Kellett, a co-worker at the abattoir, with their meeting in 1973 when she was 18 years old. He's described as a man who liked to drink, and the pair would frequently get into bar fights, with Knight willingly getting involved, with fists flying. In 1974, the pair got married, and Kellett recalls Barbara, Knight's mother, saying the following at the ceremony, quote, "You better watch this one, or she'll fucking kill you. Stir her up the wrong way, or do the wrong thing, and you're fucked. Don't ever think of playing up on her. She'll fucking kill you. That's just what you want to hear on your wedding day, the happiest day of your life." But Barbara was right. Knight was a monster, and Kellett was lucky to survive their 10-year marriage. On their wedding night, Kellett was strangled by his new bride because he didn't perform to her standards sexually. This was a sign of things to come. In early 1976, Kellett returned home one night late from a darts match, only to find that Knight had set fire to all of his clothes and shoes. She then took a frying pan and smashed him around the head. Kellett fled to the neighbour's house, where he collapsed. He had to go to hospital to receive treatment for a fractured skull. During this incident, Knight was heavily pregnant with the pair's first child and was able to use this to emotionally manipulate Kellett to make him think that her outburst was hormonal, and this persuaded him not to press charges. The pair's daughter, Melissa, was born soon after this incident, but the violence continued, and in May 1976, Kellett left Knight, fleeing the domestic abuse he was suffering by moving to Queensland. A few days later, Knight was seen pushing Melissa in her pram, violently throwing the pram from side to side, clearly taking her anger out on the child. She was then admitted to St Elmo's Hospital in Tamworth, suffering from postnatal depression, and she spent a few weeks recovering there. When she was released, it seems like she had some sort of psychotic break, and after placing 2-month-old Melissa on some railway tracks, Knight took an axe and went into town and began threatening to kill several people. Melissa was saved from the tracks by a homeless man, and Knight was arrested and returned to hospital. But, bizarrely, she was not charged with anything and not sectioned. It seems she was in the hospital voluntarily, and so signed herself out the next day. Within 72 hours, Knight had slashed the face of a woman and demanded that she drive her to Queensland to find Kellett. This woman was able to escape at a service station, and Knight then took a young child hostage, holding a knife to his throat. She was eventually arrested by police, but she didn't go down easy and fought them with all of her might. Knight ended up in psychiatric care again and disclosed that, had she got to Queensland, she would have killed Kellett and his mother. David Kellett, likely feeling some sort of guilt or loyalty, moved back to the area after leaving his new girlfriend, and when Knight was released from hospital on the 9th of August 1976, having only spent a matter of weeks getting treatment, she came to live with him. However, it was like returning to the lion's den, and Knight's behaviour became more extreme and unpredictable. Knight would call others, ranting about Kellett, stating she knew he was having affairs. Kellett worked various jobs, and this included being a delivery driver. One day, after coming home from his job, he was awoken by Knight straddling him, holding a knife to his jugular. She said, quote, "Is it true that truck drivers have a woman in every fucking town? Is it? You see how easy it is, Kellett? I could do you right here." Kellett later said in an interview, quote, "I had to talk fast, I can tell you. I was sweating and shaking. I couldn't even push her off. She had one arm across my chest and a knife into my neck. I thought I was gone. I was shit scared. It was the most horrific memory I have." Kellett was continuously abused, and Knight would often randomly swing at his head for absolutely no reason, but she was fully capable of knocking him out. Her diminutive appearance hid an unusually high amount of strength when she was in a rage, which was often. The pair had another daughter in 1980, but then, one day in 1984, Kellett came home from 3 days working away, and he found the house had been cleared out, and Knight and the children were gone. She'd left him without any warning or explanation. David Kellett was clearly bemused by this, but when he realised he was free, he promptly went out and got very, very drunk to celebrate. However, Kellett wished to see his daughters, but they were merely pawns to Knight, a way to cause him further emotional pain. Kellett would try and see the children and take them on holiday, but Knight would always come up with an excuse. One daughter he did not see for 10 years, and when he did see her, it became clear that Knight had been poisoning his daughter's mind against him, making claims of abuse. His daughter said, quote, "Mom reckons your dick needs to be cut off, Dad." By 1986, Katherine Knight had found her next victim, partner. At this time it was 38-year-old minor David Saunders. Within months, Saunders moved in with Knight, but kept hold of his flat, a sensible idea as it gave him somewhere to escape to. After only 2 months, Knight's mask slipped and she began abusing Saunders. She was paranoid and extremely jealous. She would spend all of her time with Saunders, and, when she wasn't around him, would create scenarios in her head where he'd be sleeping with other women. When he got home, she would confront him and accuse him of having affairs, and If she ever found out he was spending time with a woman, even on a casual basis, this woman would be the focus of her paranoia and rage. Knight would continuously claim that she was pregnant in order to gain sympathy from others. She would accuse Saunders of cheating on her and that this was particularly heinous as she was pregnant, which she wasn't. Later, Knight would repeatedly call the police on Saunders and go to the hospital and make claims that he'd been beating her and she thought she was pregnant. This never turned out to be true, and hospital staff became used to her lies, but would have to treat her injuries, even though they didn't match the type of violence she was talking about. David Saunders would frequently flee to his flat, and it was here that Knight would go searching for him, going to the property and then driving the streets and going to bars looking for him. In May 1987, the pair had a blazing argument, and this spilled into the kitchen. Knight grabbed a knife and ran towards Saunders. He thought he was going to be stabbed, but she ran past him and into the backyard. She then picked up Saunders' dingo pup, aged only 2 months old, and slit the animal's throat. It seems Saunders did not see this brutal act, but came into the backyard to see Knight holding the pup, which had a gaping wound in its neck, with blood everywhere. This act was apparently to show Saunders the consequences of daring to leave her or cheat on her. However, Saunders found himself drawn to Knight and kept returning, where he would suffer repeated violent abuse. He was seen by his co-workers frequently with knife wounds and bruises on his body, and, on some occasions, they would stitch up his wounds. In June 1988, the pair had a daughter, Knight's third child, and Saunders decided the family needed more space, and so he put a deposit on a house. Knight had suffered an injury at work in 1986, and so, after 15 years of working at an abattoir, she was now unemployed, but she was given a sizable amount of compensation. She used this money to decorate the house, and her choice of decor showed her morbid fascination with violence and death. Every inch of the walls and ceiling was adorned with machetes, rakes, pitchforks, animal skulls, animal skins, and rusty animal traps. Knight also collected a sizable number of violent and horror movies, which she would spend much of her day watching. In 1989, the violence David Saunders was subjected to became more extreme, and it was one incident which was the final straw for him. During an argument, Knight accused him of cheating for the 1,000th time, and then hit him in the head with an iron and stabbed him in the stomach with a pair of scissors. Saunders moved back to his apartment and returned only briefly to collect his belongings, finding that Knight had cut up all of his clothes. He then went to ground, staying with friends who were sworn to secrecy, and they denied knowing where he was when Knight inevitably came searching for him. Several months later, Saunders returned as he wanted to see his daughter. He found out that Knight had gone to the police and claimed that she was the victim of abuse from him, and so had been issued with a restraining order, which stopped him from having contact with Knight or their daughter. Sickeningly, Knight had also told this child their father was dead. Between 1990 and 1993, Katherine Knight was in a relationship with a man called John Chillingworth, a 43-year-old former abattoir worker. The pair had a son in 1991. Chillingworth doesn't appear to have suffered anywhere near the same level of abuse as her other victims, and this seems, from what I've read, due to him being physically much stronger than Knight, and he would stand up to her. It seems that Knight thought this man was not someone that she could control, and so began having affairs. In 1993, she began an affair with a man called John Price, who, unfortunately, would not survive his relationship with Katherine Knight. John Charles Thomas Price was born on the 4th of April 1955, and, despite having little schooling, was a hard worker, but also a hard-playing man. He had been driving machinery since he was a child, and spent almost 20 years as a miner. He was known as a likeable man, whose ability to consume alcohol was legendary in the local area. Price had 3 children from his marriage to a woman called Colleen, but they had separated in 1988, with 2 of the children living with him and the 3rd living with Colleen, but they would regularly visit. Price had no interest in getting married again, but was lonely and wanted a woman to come home to. In late 1993, he met Katherine Knight at a bar and was smitten. Soon afterwards, Knight and her children moved in with Price and his. However, within months, Knight began showing her true colours. This became worse as she began to drink more when spending time with Price, which seemed to make her behaviour even worse. The pair would have frequent, violent arguments where Knight would attack Price, sometimes with fists, but other times with knives. Her sexual jealousy was an ever-present feature of the relationship. She once told a friend, quote, "If I ever catch Pricey playing up on me, I told him I'd kill him and cut his dick and balls off." Knight was obsessed with marrying Price. He had no interest and was concerned this was her way of trying to get a hold over him and his property. No doubt this was true. Their arguments would frequently revolve around his unwillingness to marry her, and in 1988, after being refused again, Knight took a video camera and made a video of items that Price had taken from his place of work. She then sent this to his boss, and, as a result, Price lost his job in the mines, which he'd had for 17 years. Price was furious and kicked Knight out, but she always found a way to worm her way back into the property. Katherine Knight also tried to divide and conquer the family, inevitably seeing John Price's children as being a barrier to having ultimate control in the property. With one of the children, Knight told her she was adopted and that Price was not her real father. This devastated the child, and, whilst they were told this was a lie by Price and Colleen, Knight would continue to repeat this lie over and over again, chipping away at this child's self-esteem and trust in their father. Because of this behaviour, Price kicked Knight out, but this was short-lived and she was soon back. Friends saw Knight's unstable behaviour up close, including one day when she was sweeping and Price grabbed her bottom in a playful way. Knight exploded and berated him for treating her, quote, like a slut, for just as quickly acting as though nothing had happened and going back to her sweeping. Throughout the relationship, but especially in 1998 and the beginning of 1999, Price was seen by colleagues with more and more wounds and would frequently show that knife wounds to his chest where Knight had stabbed him during an argument. In February 2000, Price was subjected to a series of serious assaults, including being stabbed in the chest, and he finally had enough of Knight and kicked her out of the house for the last time. In retaliation, Knight had gone to the police and made various claims against him. On the 29th of February 2000, John Price stopped at Scone Magistrates Court on his way to work to take out a restraining order to keep Knight away from him and his children. When he went to work, he told his workmates what he was doing, and they'd begged him to stay with them rather than returning home. Price left work that day, telling his friends that if he did not turn up for work the next day, then he had been murdered by Katherine Knight. Unfortunately, Price's comments would come true that very night. What John Price did not know was that Katherine Knight had already decided to kill him. How dare he not suffer her abuse without complaint? How dare he kick her out onto the street? In Knight's mind, she could do no wrong. It was the men in her life who were always to blame. Price was trying to break free of her control. He deserved to die. On the 29th of February 2000, she began to put her plan in motion, collecting her butcher's knives, which had been freshly sharpened, and bought some new lingerie. Price went out that night and came back at 11 p.m. and got into bed. He was awoken by Knight, who'd let herself in and, unknown to him, hidden a boning knife next to the bed. She was also wearing the new lingerie that she'd just purchased. The pair had sex, and Price appears to have fallen back asleep. At some point in the early hours of the 1st of March 2000, Katherine Knight began stabbing John Price. He quickly woke up and, running on adrenaline, tried to escape the house. He ran out of the bedroom, and Knight pursued him and continuously stabbed him. She aimed at his chest, trying to pierce his major organs. An arterial spray covered the walls and floor as Price tried to make it to the front door. The attack was frenzied, and by the time he got to the front door, John Price had been stabbed approximately 30 times. He managed to make it out of the front door, but was dragged back in by Knight, who carried on stabbing him again and again and again. Finally, after being stabbed 37 times, John Price passed away. However, if the nature of his death was not bad enough, what happened next is almost beyond belief. In order to frame the horror in this case, I'll present the scene as police officers discovered it. They were called us around 6 a.m. when Price's workmates, due to concerns that he'd not turned up to work, came to his house and saw blood on the door. At about 8 a.m, officers entered the property and found blood everywhere, soaked in the floor and splattered all over the walls. On the left, immediately past the front door, was the lounge, and here they found John Price's body propped up with his legs crossed, with his left arm slumped over an empty drinks bottle. However, Price had been decapitated and his corpse had been skinned. Between the lounge and the kitchen was an archway. An officer saw what they thought was some kind of fabric covering the opening. When they got closer, they realised to their horror they were staring at the skin of a human being, John Price's skin, which was hanging from a hook. At her eventual trial, the judge described the skinning of Price, stating that, quote, "It was carried out with considerable expertise and an obviously steady hand, so that his skin, including that of the head, face, nose, ears, neck, torso, genital organs and legs, was removed so as to form one pelt." So expertly was it done, after post-mortem examination, the skin was able to be re-sewn on Price's body in a way which indicated a clear and appropriate, albeit grisly, methodology. Moving into the kitchen, the true evil of Katherine Knight was uncovered. On the hob was what the judge called a, quote, "sickening stew," with John Price's head simmering on the stove in a pot containing vegetables. On the table were 2 meals which included meat and vegetables. This meat had been taken from Price's buttocks and cooked in the oven. Beside each meal was a card with the names of Price's children on them. This sick monster was intending to feed John Price to his own children. Outside the property was found the remains of a 3rd meal, which was apparently thrown out of the window. It's been speculated, but never concluded, that Knight had made this meal, eaten some of Price's body, found it unpalatable, and thrown it away. On top of a photograph of Price was a handwritten, poorly spelt note written by Knight, which stated, "Time got you back, Jonathan, for raping my daughter." This was a lie. Price had never harmed any of Knight's children. The murder weapon, a large boning knife, was found at the scene. Police knew who had committed the crime and quickly tracked down Katherine Knight. I've read various sources which suggest she was found at a separate location, having left the scene, but others stating that she was in the same property with Price's body. Wherever she was found, Knight had taken an overdose, but it doesn't appear this was a particularly serious attempt to end her life. It was likely a tactic to try and gain sympathy from the police, despite the horror of her actions. Knight was taken to hospital, but quickly recovered and was interviewed by the police while still a patient. As shown by this clip, Knight claimed not to remember anything of the night she butchered John Price, but did remember an incident where she had stabbed him. But notice her language when describing it. It was an accident, and only because Price had been aggressive to her. Once Price got off the phone, he started on me, and I was around washing up, and it could have been a fork, a spoon, or anything in my hand. It was a knife that cut your meal with, and I aimed it at him and it got him. He was leaning closer than what I thought, and light eyesight was bad at that time. I've only had new glasses since then. Despite Katherine Knight claiming she couldn't remember anything, the evidence against her was overwhelming, and she was charged with the murder of John Price. Once she'd been discharged from the hospital, Katherine Knight was remanded into Silverwater Correctional Complex, a maximum security women's prison just outside Sydney. She was notorious in the prison before she'd even arrived, due to the publicity about her crimes. People were surprised, both staff and inmates, that this small, quiet woman could be responsible for such horror. Knight seemed to thrive in prison. She told family members that she loved life inside, and that this was the first time that people were paying attention to her and taking care of her. However, Knight was incapable of not working some sort of angle, and she would tell everyone and anyone how much of a monster John Price was, and how she was the innocent victim, although she could not remember killing and skinning him. However, there's a difference between manipulating others in prison and facing an overwhelming mountain of evidence in court, and this was the challenge facing Knight when court proceedings started on the 2nd of February 2001. She offered to plead to the charge of manslaughter, basically, in her case, claiming that she'd killed Price, but this was not premeditated and apparently something she couldn't remember doing. This was rejected, and her trial for murder was set for July 2001, before being pushed back to the 15th of October 2001. In the months before the trial, Katherine Knight was assessed by various psychiatrists for the defence and the prosecution, and whilst there were some similarities in their assessments, there were obviously substantial disagreements. There seemed to be an agreement that Knight was of borderline low intelligence, but, as stated by an individual who met her, seemed to live her life off, quote, rat cunning, which I believe is trying to imply some sort of innate skills in finding opportunities and exploiting them, scurrying around from place to place, manipulating and abusing others to get what she wanted. They also noted that she had chronic low self-esteem, shyness, difficulty coping with the end of relationships, unstable emotions, difficulty controlling her anger, anxiety when re-experiencing childhood abuse, continued fear of being raped and of her children being sexually abused, as well as avoidance when talking about her own experiences of abuse as a child. The consensus was that Knight was suffering from borderline personality disorder, also known as emotionally unstable personality disorder, which is a lifelong condition where the sufferer has significant difficulties with their thinking and behaviour, including having feelings of chronic emptiness, lack of identity, unstable mood in relationships, a profound fear of abandonment, as well as a tendency to act with violence when confronted with an emotional difficulty in their lives. She was also found to have post-traumatic stress disorder linked to her own experiences of abuse as a child. Whilst the defence seemed to give credibility to Katherine Knight's claim that she could not remember the offence, the Crown countered this and said there appeared to be no medical reason why she could not remember this incident and that she was lying. Bolstering this case for several points. Firstly, the premeditated nature of the offence. Even if Knight could not remember the killing itself, she had brought the murder weapon with her. Also, the time she spent in her task. Not only killing Price, but she took time to skin him, cut meat from his body, and make meals to try and feed his children. Also, it came out in court that midway through her crimes, Knight had taken Price's bank card, gone to an ATM, and withdrawn money from his account. For a woman who apparently blacked out, I was implying she was merely acting on impulse, with no control. She seems to have been in control enough to find the bank card, remember the PIN number, and draw the money out in order to make gain for herself. Basically, it was bullshit. Someone claiming they cannot remember their actions, especially when related to really serious offences, is very, very common, and is 99.9% of the time simply a way to avoid taking responsibility, and also a way to remain in control. Yeah, I killed them, but I'm not telling you why. That'll be my secret. A few days after the trial began in October 2001, to the shock of everyone, Katherine Knight pleaded guilty to murdering John Price. Sources I've read say it's never been made clear why Knight did this, as, to this day, she continues to claim she cannot remember killing him. I personally think it's very simple. The case against her was overwhelming. Not only the forensic evidence at the crime scene, but also, it seems, Knight would literally tell everyone who would listen that she would one day kill John Price. She knew she would be convicted, and her only play was to plead guilty in order to get a reduced sentence. However, if this is what she hoped for, she would be sorely disappointed. On the 8th of November 2001, Knight stood before Justice Barry O'Keefe for sentencing. His sentencing remarks spanned 40 pages and took an hour to deliver. During his comments, he reflected on the, quote, steady hand and grisly methodology Knight demonstrated during the murder, skinning and butchering of Price. He also stated, quote, "The prisoners pleaded guilty to a murder which falls into the most serious category of murders. I'm satisfied beyond any doubt that such murder was premeditated. I'm further satisfied the same way that not only did she plan the murder, but she also enjoyed the horrific acts which followed in its wake as part of a ritual of death and defilement. The things which she did after the death of Mr. Price indicate cognition, volition, calm and skill. I'm satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that her evil actions were the playing out of her resentments arising out of her rejection by Mr. Price, her impending expulsion from Mr. Price's home, and his refusal to share with her his assets, particularly his home, which he wanted to retain for his children. I have no doubt that her claim to amnesia forms part of her plan to effect madness in order to escape the consequences of her acts and to provide a convenient basis on which to rely to avoid detailed questioning by the police and escape punishment. As I've said, the prisoners showed no mercy whatsoever to Mr. Price. The last minutes of his life must have been a time of abject terror for him, as they were a time of utter enjoyment for her. At no time during the hearing, or prior thereto, did the prisoner express any regret for what she had done, or any remorse for having done it, not even through the surrogacy of her counsel. Her attitude in that regard is consistent with her general approach to the many acts of violence which she had engaged in against her various partners, namely, they deserved it. In addition, the prisoner's history of violence, together with her flawed personality, caused me to conclude, along with Dr. Milton and the other psychiatrists called in this case, that she is without doubt a very dangerous person, and likely, if released into the community, to commit further acts of serious violence, including even murder against those who cross her, particularly males. A crime of the kind committed by the prisoner calls for the maximum penalty the law empowers the court to impose. He then sentenced her, stating, quote, "An examination of the cases referred to by counsel supports a view that I formed, namely that the only appropriate penalty for the prisoner is life imprisonment and that parole should never be considered for her. The prisoner should never be released. Katherine Mary Knight, you're pleaded guilty to and been convicted of the murder of John Charles Thomas Price at Aberdeen in the state of New South Wales on or about the 29th of February 2000. In respect to that crime, I sentence you to imprisonment for life." John Price's family erupted into applause. Knight simply smiled, turned, and went back to prison to spend the rest of her life behind bars, the first woman in Australia to receive such a sentence. In 2006, Knight appealed her sentence to the New South Wales Court of Appeal, saying that her punishment was too severe. Her appeal was rejected, with the judgment stating, quote, "This was an appalling crime, almost beyond contemplation in a civilized society." Katherine Knight is now 67 years old and remains housed at Silverwater Correctional Complex. She appears to have spent the last 21 years relatively quietly, and I cannot find any real record of what she's been up to. Regardless, she will remain behind bars for the rest of her natural life. I want to discover this case for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I think it's a really interesting but truly horrifying case. Secondly, it's because, as someone pointed out, I've mainly focused on male on female domestic violence cases and wanted to cover a case where the roles are reversed. This is an extreme example of this, but it enables me to highlight similarities in the profiles of male and female domestic abuse perpetrators, but also key differences I've found. So, the similarities. Going back to the profile I've gone over several times, both male and female domestic abuse perpetrators seek to gain and maintain control over their intimate partners, often due to their emotional dependence on relationships, fear of abandonment, and low self-esteem. They think that, if given the choice, their partner will inevitably leave them, so they need to do everything they can to make sure this doesn't happen. The best way to do this is to take away their victim's choice by making them feel so low, so afraid, and making their life so empty that, even if it wanted to leave, they would feel unable to. If they show defiance in a relationship, i.e. thinking for themselves or acting without permission, they get punished, which reinforces the control the perpetrator has over them, but also shows them the consequences of defiance. Those with extreme issues with abandonment will often be fixated on their partner cheating on them and will constantly accuse them of infidelity, often without any evidence. This is a reflection of their fear of being abandoned. They'll confront their partner, accuse them of cheating, as I said, without any real evidence, putting their victim in an impossible situation. If they deny what the perpetrator has already decided they've done, they'll be punished. If they admit it, they will be punished. A terrible situation to be in, I think you'll agree. So, that's the similarities. What are the differences? The differences are subtle, but important, and, in my experience, relate to hatred of certain genders. Let me explain. So often the most serious perpetrators of male on female domestic abusers have extremely negative views about women, sometimes pure hatred of this gender. This is often linked back to experiences with their mother, including being abandoned by them or not protected by them. For example, them being taken into care or not being protected from an abusive partner. The same is true of most dangerous female perpetrators of domestic abuse, but I found that this hatred of men is far more pronounced and, to a great extent, understandably so. Unfortunately, it's the fact that female children are more likely to be the victim of horrific acts of abuse over a sustained period of time when they are growing up, most usually sexual abuse, and this is often by men they know and should be able to trust, such as their father, siblings, or other family members. These experiences, which often go on for years and years and are usually unreported, understandably can lead them to have extremely negative views of men, seeing them as perverts, abusers, as well as this type of behaviour destroying their self-esteem, sense of self-worth, and identity. With both men and women who hold these negative views of the other gender, their behaviour is often far more extreme, often sadistic, and is not only used to gain and maintain control over their partner, but also, in their mind, to punish them for being male or female, taking out their hatred of their father, mother, etc. on this individual who happens to share the same gender. A good example of the level of violence a man who clearly hates women can display is Peter Tobin, who regularly raped his partners and, in one case, forced a knife into his partner's vagina, causing her such horrific injuries that she could not have children. He also decapitated a pet dog just to cause a girlfriend emotional pain. With Katherine Knight, her horrific upbringing inevitably led her to form a deep hatred of males because of what they did to her. This behaviour also destroyed her self-esteem and meant that she struggled to be alone, so she had to turn to men, who she hated, for comfort. When in the relationships, she sought to control them and punish them, and as each relationship broke down, her hatred increased. Men were evil, but she needed them. This is the horrific contradiction in the mind of the abuser. Due to the violence she experienced and saw in her childhood, this was ingrained in her as a way to solve issues and gain power over people. By the time she met John Price, she had several failed relationships under her belt, all because, in her mind, these men were dicks, and her anger and abandonment issues had got to the point where she was willing to kill and felt completely justified in doing so. You may think that it's just speculation that Knight had a hatred of men, or she made no qualms about telling people this, regularly telling her partners and anyone who would listen that, quote, all men are cunts. Unfortunately, Price tried to escape the relationship, to abandon Knight, like so many men had done before, and she couldn't have that. He needed to be punished, but, more than that, he needed to be utterly destroyed. So, she not only killed him, but butchered him, hanging his skin like some sort of trophy, treating him like cattle. Knight trying to feed Price to his own children, I think served two purposes. Firstly, it was to punish them, because she thought they were a barrier to her gaining complete control in the household. Secondly, I think she took great pleasure in imagining John Price being sickened by what she was trying to do to his children. I have some sympathy for Katherine Knight, as I do with anyone who's had an abusive background. However, we all have choices. An abusive childhood does not mean you have the right to abuse others. Katherine Knight made choices, and she's now having to live with the consequences of her decisions. I've included contact information for support services for women in previous videos, and I'm sure I'll return to this. But for this video, I want to focus on support services for men. However, across the board, regardless of your gender identity or your sexual preference, if you're going through this, I need you to hear me. This is not your fault. Some of the bravest and strongest people I've ever met have been those going through domestic abuse or have escaped it. An abuser will try to make you feel worthless, but this isn't true. Not at all. You are worth something. You're worth so much more than they've made you feel. With men specifically, I think unfortunately we often have a barrier in our head where, because we are male, we need to be seen as strong, and we convince ourselves that these things don't happen to men, but they do. And there are organisations and people who will not judge you and will help you. There are plenty of people like me out there who would stand by your side and support you every step of the way. Graham Frederick Young was born on the 7th of September 1947 to Fred and Bessie Young in Neasden, Middlesex in the UK. He also had an older sister, Winifred. Young's mother died of tuberculosis when he was only 14 weeks old. Fred, overcoming grief, felt he could no longer look after the children, so Young was sent to live with his aunt and uncle, whilst his sister was sent to live with their grandparents. Young spent 2 years living with his aunt and uncle and became close to them. Eventually, his father recovered, remarried a woman called Molly, and the family reunited, moving to St Albans in the county of Hertfordshire, north of London. However, Young appeared to take separation from his aunt and uncle badly, and, from this point on, seemed to withdraw into himself and was described as, quote, a peculiar child who made no effort to socialise with other children. Young was a voracious reader and, from the time he could read, was never far from a book. He became fascinated with 3 particular topics: poisoners, Nazi Germany, and the occult. With regards to the first of these topics, Young became particularly fascinated with the crimes of Hawley Harvey Crippen, who murdered his wife Cora with poison in 1910 before fleeing to America, before he was captured, returned to England, and executed that same year. Young also cited Victorian poisoner William Palmer as being a particular hero of his. Palmer was an English doctor, dubbed the, quote, Prince of Poisoners, who was executed by hanging in 1856 for the murder of a friend to inherit his estate. However, he's suspected of killing around 15 people by poisoning, including his wife, 4 of his infant children, his brother, and his mother-in-law. Young's research led him, at a very young age, to have developed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of poisons. Young was also obsessed with Nazi Germany and would tell anyone who would listen how Hitler was, quote, misunderstood. He even took to making himself swastikas, including a brass medallion displaying this symbol, which he would proudly wear. With regards to the occult, Young appeared to fixate on this and developed a belief that he could receive power through sacrifice, and even allegedly tried to get local children involved in sacrificing cats for this purpose. Cats did disappear at an alarming frequency in the neighbourhood around Young's childhood home, and, whilst it was never determined to be him, I think this is likely. So you have a child with an in-depth knowledge of poisons who's obsessed with Hitler, the architect of a regime that exterminated millions of people through use of poison gas, as well as having a fixation on death and an obsession with famous poisoners. What could possibly go wrong? Unfortunately, it turned out a lot, and this was enabled by a bizarre quirk of society at this time. Specifically, between at least the 1800s and it would appear until the 1970s, people could freely purchase lethal doses of poison without any real oversight or questions being asked. Poisons such as arsenic were freely available in different forms, including rat poison and flypaper, and others you could buy just in their natural state. All one needed to obtain this was to walk into a chemist, buy the items, and then sign what is known as the, quote, poison register. This still exists to this day, but in fact this case led to a tightening in the sale of poisons. However, back in the day, people would, it appears from looking at other cases, just sign the register, often giving false details without anyone batting an eyelid. This was apparently the case in the 1960s, where at the age of 13 years old, Graham Young walked into several chemists and, due to his extensive knowledge of poisons, was able to convince them that he was 17 years old. This enabled Young to purchase lethal quantities of various poisons, including his 2 favourites, thallium and antimony, with him signing the poison register as M.E. Evans. I'm not a chemist, but I've looked into both these substances that Young purchased, and they are vicious, with them causing, amongst other things, extreme abdominal or muscular pain, vomiting, diarrhea, hallucinations, as well as causing serious damage to the internal organs and nervous system. Death could be quick or slow, depending on whether single large doses are administered or smaller doses are given over a longer period of time. But as the organs and bodily functions are disrupted, individuals can die in excruciating agony. Thallium is particularly lethal, and even touching it can be deadly. How much poison Young was able to purchase at the age of 13 is not explicitly stated, but it's estimated that he was able to purchase enough to kill 100 to 300 people. Young took these poisons and began experimenting with them, using a chemistry set that his father had bought him. But it's believed that Graham Young began poisoning others at around the age of 13, with him administering doses of poison to a child of a similar age called Christopher Williams. Christopher, I've read, was Young's only friend, and it was used as a type of guinea pig, with Young administering a cocktail of poisons over a protracted period of time, which meant he experienced vomiting, cramps, and headache. How he did this is unclear, but it appears that Young and Christopher would often exchange their sandwiches at lunchtime at school, so it's likely that Young laced these with poison. Christopher was lucky to survive, but it appears that Young was unsatisfied with this experience, as the poisoning meant that Christopher was off school, so he could not observe this experiment up close. Young needed subjects he could poison and then watch deteriorate, so he turned to his own family. In February 1961, still aged only 13, Graham Young began poisoning members of his own family. He first began by poisoning his stepmother, Molly Young, administering antimony to her drinks and food. This led to her suffering vomiting, diarrhea, and excruciating stomach pains. In the next month, Fred Young, patriarch of the family, also suffered from similar stomach cramps, which would leave him bedbound for days at a time. In November 1961, Young's sister Winifred was given a cup of tea by her brother one morning, but found it tasted so sour she took one mouthful and then threw it away. An hour later, she was on a train to work, where she began to hallucinate. Members of the public had to help her when she collapsed at the train station, and an ambulance was called. Tests in hospital revealed she'd been poisoned. Fred suspected his son of having been responsible and searched his room where his chemistry set was located. However, Fred took no further action, aside from telling Young to be careful in the future when, quote, messing about with those bloody chemicals. It appears that over 1961, Young was administering small doses of poison, specifically antimony, to his sister, father, and stepmother. But in 1962, the main focus of his experiment was his stepmother, Molly. On the evening of the 21st of April 1962, Molly was found writhing in agony in the garden, with Young stood watching her, fascinated by her death throes. It transpired that Young had either got bored of the protracted nature of his current experiment or decided to escalate his behaviour and had poisoned Molly with a lethal dose of thallium the day before. Molly was taken to hospital, where she died in agony a few hours later. Her death was assigned to complications related to a car accident which she'd recently had, which I find inexplicable. Young suggested that Molly should be cremated, which occurred, so no further examination of her corpse could take place. Graham Young appeared to be fixated on harming as many people as possible, and at Molly's wake, he laced a mustard jar with poison, leading to at least one man becoming seriously ill. With Molly out of the way, Young continued poisoning his father and sister, and this only stopped when Fred was hospitalized in May 1962 after his attacks of vomiting and cramping became increasingly severe. Tests were run, and Fred was found to have been poisoned over months with antimony, and he was believed to be one dose away from death. However, Fred still appeared unable or unwilling to believe his son was to blame. It was his school that finally raised the alarm, after a teacher found vials of poison in his desk. The school had Young interviewed by a psychiatrist, posing as a careers advisor, and it became clear that Young was obsessed with poisons and had clearly used these substances to harm others. The school called the police, and on the 23rd of May 1962, Graham Young was arrested when he returned home from school. When Graham Young was arrested in May 1962, he was found in possession of vials of poison in his school blazer, and he freely admitted, apparently with great pride, to having poisoned his father, sister, a school friend, and his stepmother Molly, and that he deliberately administered a lethal dose to the latter, resulting in her death. Due to the cremation of Molly's body, there was no way to verify his claims that he had murdered her, and therefore he couldn't be charged with this. Instead, he was charged with 3 counts of, quote, malicious administration of a noxious thing to inflict grievous bodily harm. In July 1962, Graham Young appeared at the Old Bailey in London, where he pleaded guilty to the charges and was assessed by psychiatrists. One, Dr. Christopher Fish, testified in court that Young was a psychopath who had failed to, quote, develop a normal moral sense, and he felt that Young was extremely likely to reoffend. He also recounted a conversation with Young where he was unconcerned about the damage he had caused, but instead was upset about being unable to get his hands on his vials of poison, with him saying, quote, "I'm missing my antimony. I miss the power it gives me." The recommendation was that Graham Young should be sent to Broadmoor High Security Hospital and remain there for a term of at least 15 years, with his release back into the community only being directed if he was no longer deemed a danger to society. So, at the age of just 14 years old, Graham Young became one of the youngest patients to ever enter Broadmoor. Interesting fact, the youngest patient ever to enter Broadmoor was a person called William Giles, who was sent there at the age of 10 in 1885 after committing arson. He spent the rest of his life, 77 years in Broadmoor, dying there in 1962 aged 87. Graham Young is one of those rare people who is so dangerous there's literally no environment which can contain them and protect those around them. As an example, soon after coming to Broadmoor, a patient called John Berridge died an agonising death from cyanide poisoning. This was a man that Young had written about in his letters to his family, stating that John was annoying him with his snoring. So, Young decided to eliminate the issue. He took laurel bush leaves, of which there were large amounts in the locality, and which naturally contained cyanide, extracted this, and then used it to poison John. Young freely confessed that he killed John to staff at Broadmoor, but for some inexplicable reason, they marked his death as a suicide. I imagine this was just to avoid the hassle of an inquiry. However, this was not an isolated incident. On one occasion, bleach was found in staff's coffee, and in 1968, so 6 years into Graham Young's stay, industrial cleaner was found to have gone missing. This was found in the communal tea urn used by approximately 100 people, but luckily before anyone had drunk from it. It appears that both staff and patients knew full well what Young was doing, and it stated that staff would jokingly tell patients, quote, "Unless you behave, I'll let Graham make your coffee." Young was also still fascinated with Nazism and walk around Broadmoor adorned with swastikas he'd made, including pendants and medallions. He would also continue to espouse the virtues of Hitler. Despite his behaviour in Broadmoor, including him confessing that he killed a fellow patient, his original suggested tariff of 15 years, and the fact that he clearly tried to poison others over the years, in 1970, Broadmoor psychiatrist Dr. Edgar Udwin wrote to the Home Secretary and recommended that Graham Young should be released, as he was no longer a danger to society and, quote, no longer obsessed with poisons, violence, and mischief. Cynically, I think this bizarre decision was potentially due to the fact that Young was causing so many issues in Broadmoor, and they just wanted to get rid of him. Or perhaps Dr. Udwin was really crap at his job. Either way, in early 1971, after 8 years in Broadmoor, and aged just 23, this dangerous psychopath was released from Broadmoor. Just prior to his release, he told a nurse, quote, "When I get out, I'm going to kill one person for every year I've spent in this place." This comment was considered a serious threat, noted down and put in Young's file, but was never acted upon. If you think that this is a calamity of failures, what happened next is even more staggering. As soon as Graham Young was released in early 1971, he appeared to go on a journey down memory lane, going to chemists that he bought poison from and proudly stating his name, and appearing to be disappointed when they did not receive him as some sort of celebrity. Similarly, Young approached his old school teachers and spoke to them about his time away, focusing more on telling them about his crimes as opposed to his rehabilitation. Again, Young appeared unhappy that he was not more infamous and that the world had apparently continued turning despite his absence. Within weeks of his release, Young had purchased his favourite poisons, thallium and antimony, from a chemist and began to poison people. He began with 34-year-old Trevor Speaks, who was a housemate at a hostel he was staying at in Slough, Berkshire. Soon after Young moved in, Trevor began to experience abdominal pains and sickness whenever he drank anything. Young said a glass of wine would help his symptoms, but this only made the sickness worse. Trevor survived, but had severe abdominal pains for years. Around this same time, another man, whose name I cannot find, apparently had a drink with a man who looked exactly like Graham Young and who was obsessed with poisons. This man apparently became severely ill but survived, but eventually, years later, committed suicide because of the ongoing severe pain he experienced from being poisoned. In May 1971, Graham Young moved to Hertfordshire and applied for a job at a small firm called John Hadland Limited in the village of Bovington, which made photographic lenses. The company contacted Broadmoor for references and were apparently informed that Young was rehabilitated. However, Broadmoor did not tell the company that Young was a convicted poisoner, had admitted killing a fellow patient, and had made threats to kill people when he got out, so he was hired. Young's job included making and distributing hot drinks, and each employee had their own mug, so it was easier for him to target specific individuals. Young was described as a morose, unsociable man who would only become involved in conversations if they were on topics he was interested in, specifically war, Nazis, poison, and famous murderers. Aside from these interactions, he would keep himself to himself and barely speak to anyone unless he absolutely had to. Immediately, Young began poisoning his co-workers. Young began to poison 59-year-old Bob Eagle, his immediate superior. Bob was a World War II veteran and, within days of first meeting Young, had to take time off work with diarrhea, vomiting, and severe stomach pains. Bob's health improved when he left to go on holiday, but when he returned, as with his stepmother Molly all those years ago, Graham Young laced Bob's tea with a fatal dose of thallium. Bob's condition deteriorated quickly, resulting in him having profuse vomiting and diarrhea, as well as extreme pain in his abdomen and back. Bob was admitted to hospital and transferred to the intensive care unit. However, his organs shut down, and Bob died an agonizing death on the 7th of July 1971. His death was not considered suspicious. The callousness of Graham Young is demonstrated by his feigned concern for Bob, with him regularly calling the hospital to get updates on his condition. I have no doubt that this was his way of getting a sick thrill by getting updates about the agony that Bob was in and how his life was ebbing away. Young also poisoned at least 4 other co-workers, with his modus operandi being to slip poison into their tea or coffee. One of these people, Diana Smith, was poisoned when Young spiked her tea. Later, police found a diary entry where Young had written that Diana had, quote, "irritated me yesterday, so I packed her off home with an attack of sickness. I only gave her something to shake her up. I now regret that I didn't give her a larger dose, capable of laying her up for a few days." Unfortunately, Young was able to avoid detection because, coincidentally, a stomach bug had been going around the local area, known as the, quote, Bovington bug, so it was assumed that the employees falling ill had succumbed to this virus. Before the truth could be revealed, 56-year-old local councillor and part-time employee at Hadland Limited, Fred Biggs, was targeted by Young, who began by slipping small doses of antimony into his drinks. Then, on the 30th of October 1971, Young put a massive dose of thallium into Fred's tea, and within 24 hours, he developed chest pains and had difficulty breathing. Fred was soon transferred to the intensive care unit in Whittington Hospital in North London, and his last few weeks on Earth were like something out of a nightmare. His nervous system began to shut down, so he could not speak or breathe on his own. He was in perpetual excruciating pain, and eventually, his skin began to peel off. Fred eventually died on the 17th of November 1971, and again, poisoning was not suspected. Young was again reveling in his offending, calling the hospital and even Fred's wife to get updates on his condition. As with other psychopaths and narcissists, Graham Young couldn't help but find some way to brag about his behaviour, and his own arrogance was his undoing. Specifically, the day after Fred's death, the company doctor gathered all the staff and tried to reassure them due to the number of illnesses and deaths the company had had in such a short time. The doctor became concerned when Young began grilling him about thallium poisoning. Young's demeanour and his apparent expansive knowledge of poisons raised alarm bells, and the police were called. The police then looked into the situation and quickly found that the deaths and illnesses had started soon after Graham Young had started the company. They consulted with doctors who stated that the symptoms of those who had died and come unwell was likely as a result of deliberate poisoning. They also saw Young's criminal record and could see the reasons why he'd been sent to Broadmoor. Only then were the company informed of who Graham Young really was, but obviously by that point it was far too late. The police knew they had their man, and when they searched Graham Young's flat, they had all the evidence they needed. In particular, the most incriminating piece of evidence was a meticulous diary that Young had kept, in which he documented the progress of his, quote, patients, including dosages he had given them and resulting symptoms. He also wrote whether he was going to allow his victims to live or die. Also found in his property was enough poison to kill in excess of 300 people. In addition, it was found that Young had adorned his walls with pictures of Hitler and other Nazi leaders, as well as drawings of emaciated figures holding bottles labelled poison, clutching their throats. On November the 21st, 1971, Graham Young was finally arrested. Young gleefully confessed to poisoning and killing Bob Eagle and Fred Biggs, as well as poisoning 2 other people. He bragged that he committed the, quote, perfect murder by killing his stepmother Molly Young in 1962. Young was eventually charged with multiple offences, including 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, and he was held in prison awaiting his day in court. So, remember, we had a psychiatrist who stated that Graham Young was no longer a danger to society, so he should be released. And, in less than 10 months, he'd poisoned numerous people and murdered at least 2, and no one bothered to tell his employers that he was a poisoner whose modus operandi was to lace people's drinks. Absolutely mind-boggling. The evidence against Graham Young was overwhelming, not only due to his own confession, but the poisons found in his property and the fact that subsequently, thallium had been found in the internal organs of Fred Biggs and the cremated remains of Bob Eagle. However, it was clear he was intent on enjoying the spotlight and so pleaded not guilty to all offences, resulting in him going to trial at St Albans Crown Court, which started on the 19th of June 1972. Young took the stand clearly as a way to demonstrate just how clever he was, and he assisted his defence in poking holes in the prosecution's case. It appears that Young potentially believed his own superiority and his lies, with him writing to a cousin stating, quote, I stand a good chance of acquittal, for the prosecution case has a number of inherent weaknesses. A strong point in my favour is that I am not guilty of the charges. To no one's surprise, Graham Young was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to life imprisonment. I cannot find whether a minimum tariff was set, but I think it's likely that authorities wanted him to die behind bars, which, eventually, he did. So, by the age of 25, Graham Young was again behind bars, this time unlikely ever to be released. He was dubbed the teapot poisoner by the press, and it's clear that he revelled in his notoriety and demanded recognition in prison. In prison, Young continued to espouse his love of Hitler and would often grow a moustache in honour of his idol. He was hated by other prisoners. The one person he bonded with was Ian Brady, the Moors murderer, with the pair apparently bonding over their love of the Nazis. It's clear that evil attracts evil, and despite the remorselessness of Graham Young's offending, Ian Brady wrote that, quote, it was difficult not to empathise with Graham Young. I cannot think of a worse pairing than Ian Brady and Graham Young. The only positive of this story is that neither are amongst the living any longer. With Graham Young, on August the 1st, 1990, he was found dead in his cell at H&P Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight. He was 42 years old. The cause of death was determined to be a heart attack. However, Young had no history of heart disease, which led people to speculate that his death was suspicious and that he may have been killed by other inmates or staff. However, I think a more likely conclusion is that Young found a way to poison himself, ending his own life in order to escape justice, his last act of control. This is a fascinating case, as I don't think I've covered many people as cold and remorseless as Graham Young, and definitely not a case involving poison. Graham Young was, in my humble opinion, the epitome of a psychopath, a man who had no empathy or conscience for what he did. Young is, in many respects, an easier case to understand, as he made his motivation to the thinking quite obvious, with him stating, as already said, that he missed the power that the poisons gave him. And another insightful quote came from his final arrest where, when asked how he could justify killing human beings, he stated, quote, "I suppose I'd ceased to see them as people. At least, a part of me had. They were simply guinea pigs." Taking these comments together, I believe that Graham Young saw himself as some sort of god, and mere mortals akin to rats running around a maze, with him in ultimate control of their fate and destiny. Young saw himself as superior to everyone, and those around him as annoyances to be experimented upon and disposed of when they became an inconvenience. I think that Young's early fascination with Hitler and Nazis was driven by the sense of power that one man can have, and how this can be bent to kill others on a mass scale, and he was trying to replicate the behaviour of his idol, including dressing like him and even growing a similar moustache. He also replicated the mass extermination technique used by this regime. In terms of poisoning, I think that Graham Young probably thought he was born out of his time, and that he wished that he'd been born in a different time, in a different country, where he'd have willingly volunteered to be part of the final solution. However, as just one man, it's clear that Graham Young was intent on maiming and killing as many people as possible. Anyone was fair game, either his family members, and anyone who simply annoyed Young, even for the most trivial of reasons, including snoring, was deemed worthy of execution. It's clear that, whilst overestimating his intelligence, Graham Young had an astute intellect, and I think this is demonstrated by the nature of his offending, with him using poison, which needs skill to administer stealthily, and it's clear he administers specific dosages depending on whether he wished to maim or kill. I imagine that Young felt ecstatic about how he was getting away with his crimes, how he was hiding in plain sight, and no one was any the wiser. I mentioned during the intro of this video that Young had killed at least 4 people, including his stepmother, a patient in Broadmoor, as well as the 2 workers at his last place of employment. However, how many people he actually killed is unclear, as it seems that the cause of death of all of the people he murdered were linked to natural causes until Young confessed. Clearly, as with the typical narcissist, Graham Young wanted praise and recognition for the work that he'd done, and I imagine he was holding back information to drip feed over the years whilst in prison. Maybe Graham Young wasn't getting the recognition he wanted and had become inconsequential, just another prisoner in the system, and that's why he took his own life. Or potentially he did indeed die of natural causes, but I find this unlikely. But, regardless of the nature of his passing, it's clear that Graham Young was an extremely dangerous and evil man, devoid of any humanity. Wednesday the 13th of March 1986 was any other school day at Dunblane Primary School in Dunblane, near Stirling in Scotland, but all that changed just after 9:30 a.m. when Thomas Hamilton, a 43-year-old paedophilic loner, walked into the school with 4 handguns and began firing. In less than 5 minutes, he murdered 17 people, including 16 children, with the oldest being 6 years old, in a case of mass murder which shocked the country and which has become known as the Dunblane Massacre. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Thomas Hamilton was born on the 10th of May 1952 in Glasgow, Scotland. He had a confusing childhood, with him finding out that his older sister Agnes was in fact his mother, and that the people he thought were his parents were in fact his grandparents, and that his real father had abandoned him when he was only 18 months old. How this affected Hamilton is unclear, but I think that it's reasonable to assume that it led to a lifelong mistrust of others and perpetual anger about his lot in life. Hamilton grew up to be an unpleasant, petulant man, described as, quote, a loner, and, quote, weirdo, by those who knew him. He appeared to have 2 obsessions: clubs attended by young boys and guns. With regards to the former obsession, Hamilton was heavily involved in the Scout movement in Scotland from a young age, and, by his early 20s, was a Scout leader. However, in 1974, aged 22, he was removed from this position due to concerns about his behaviour around the boys in his charge. This initially doesn't seem to have been sexual in nature, but more his reckless disregard for their welfare. It appears that the incidents which led to him being removed from the Scouts were 2 weekend trips in 1974, where Hamilton lied and said that he had booked a hostel for him and 8 boys to stay at. However, in fact the children slept in Hamilton's van in extremely cold conditions. However, nothing was ever Hamilton's fault, and any time he was disciplined or removed from a position, he would gripe to the authorities, writing long letters to anyone who would listen about how hard done by he was. Hamilton was undeterred and set up his own, quote, boys' clubs. He would hire out halls at various schools in and around the Dunblane area for activities. Each club would see 50 to 70 boys attending. It was here that there were significant concerns about Hamilton's behaviour around these children, with him apparently telling the boys to take their shirts off, under the guise of wishing to observe their physical fitness levels. Hamilton would also run summer camps, where it's claimed that he would encourage the boys to walk around naked and rub suntan lotion into his body. Hamilton would also take pictures of the boys when they were bare-chested, and apparently made no attempts to hide his behaviour, with people who peered in the window of Hamilton's property noticing these pictures hung all over his wall. Whilst Hamilton was never prosecuted for any offences, police received at least 10 complaints about his behaviour towards these young boys and his attention towards them. Hamilton seemed obsessed with being around young male children, and so, as each one of his clubs was shut down due to concerns, he would simply ask another local authority for permission to set up somewhere else. Between 1981 and 1996, Thomas Hamilton ran at least 20 of these so-called boys' clubs. This behaviour, coupled with his possessing these pictures of children, leave me in no doubt that Thomas Hamilton was a paedophile who had a sexual interest in young male children. Hamilton was extremely litigious, and every time an allegation was made about him, he would begin bombarding councils and MPs with letters stating how everyone was slandering him and how unfairly he was being treated. However, remember, this is a man who's claiming that all accusations are malicious, but you could see pictures of shirtless boys on his wall if you went to his house. It's clear that Hamilton was a man who expected everything his way. He wants to be around young boys for his own sexual gratification and would not accept anyone trying to stop him. He couldn't give a shit about the welfare of the children or the fact that parents were trying to protect their children. No, Thomas Hamilton believed he was entitled to act in any way he wanted. Clearly, he saw nothing wrong with his behaviour. Behind closed doors, Hamilton was also a monster and a bully towards his own family members. It was revealed after the massacre that he would bully and abuse his aging grandfather, regularly shouting at him and urinating in his drinks, taking great pleasure in torturing the man. It appears that everyone in Hamilton's world was just there for him to use and abuse, and nothing was standing in his way. And there was one incident which epitomised how he dealt with people who challenged him. Specifically, in the early 90s, a mother of one of the children at his clubs had gone to the police to complain about his behaviour. Hamilton stopped outside the woman's house and confronted her, saying that he'd heard that she'd called him a pervert. Hamilton then pulled a gun from under his seat, pointed it at her, and said it was loaded. The Dunblane massacre led to a crackdown on the possession of handguns in the UK. But before this incident, certain handguns were legal to privately own, and Hamilton was obsessed with collecting and displaying his collection of firearms. 4 of these weapons he would use on the day of the murders. Hamilton would apparently talk to his guns, cooing over them as if they were children. I think guns represented power to Hamilton and made him feel less like a sad, little man. So, you had a recipe for disaster. You had a man who was obsessed with guns, had a perverted fascination with small children, and a persecution complex against a society that he saw was getting in the way of what he rightfully thought he was entitled to. In the years leading up to the massacre, Hamilton's complaints to everyone and anyone who would read them were becoming more frequent and unhinged, and it's clear he was becoming more angry and more unstable. Hamilton also appeared to be blaming the rumours about him, rather than his own behaviour, on his kitchen fitting business suffering. Word to the wise: if you want people to let you into their home to fit a kitchen, stop taking pictures of their children. In early 1996, Hamilton was again sending more deranged letters to various people, complaining about his apparent persecution, and it's in these communications that his specific disdain for Dunblane Primary School is revealed. In a letter written to a member of the local education authority in January 1996, Hamilton wrote, quote, "At Dunblane Primary School, where teachers have contaminated all the older boys with this poison, even former cleaners and dinner ladies have been told by teachers at the school that I am a pervert. There have been reports at many schools of our boys being rounded up by staff, and even warnings given to entire schools by head teachers during assembly." One of his last letters, sent on March 7th, 1996, just 6 days before the massacre, was sent to Queen Elizabeth, with Hamilton again moaning about how persecuted he was. The letter concludes with the following paragraphs, quote, "I've been involved with the organisation of boys' sports clubs for over 20 years, and the rumours circulated by officials of the Scout Association have now reached epidemic proportions across Central Region. As well as my personal distress and loss of public standing, this situation has also resulted in loss of my business and ability to earn a living. Indeed, I cannot even walk the streets for fear of embarrassing ridicule. All of this and more has been caused by the maladministration of the Scout Association and their denial of natural justice and duty of care. To some Scout officials, it was simply a ruse to oust a rival group. I turn to you as a last resort and am appealing for some sort of intervention in the hope that I may be able to regain my self-esteem in society. I am your obedient servant, Thomas W. Hamilton." I'm not sure what's more delusional, the fact that Hamilton couldn't see any issue with his behaviour and thought it was just a way for them to get rid of a, quote, rival, or the fact that he thought that he was that important that Queen Elizabeth would intervene. However, aside from writing letters, evidence was uncovered after the massacre which indicated that Hamilton may have been planning his crimes for 2 years before he acted. In particular, there was some evidence that Hamilton had been interrogating the children at his clubs about the layout and the timetable at Dunblane Primary School, and in particular which times and days had occurrences where the most number of children were gathered in one place. From these inquiries, Hamilton learned that on Wednesdays there was a school assembly, and then the Year 1 children, aged 5 to 6 years old, went straight to their PE class at the gym, with him finding out the location of this room. It's clear that Hamilton was planning an event which, in his twisted mind, would punish society for trying to stop him from indulging his sick sexual attraction to small boys. At 8:40 a.m. on the 16th of March 1996, Thomas Hamilton was seen scraping ice off his van. This was the last sighting of him prior to his rampage. Hamilton then loaded the van with 4 handguns, including 2 9mm Browning HP pistols and 2 .357 Magnum revolvers. He also brought with him 743 rounds of ammunition and ear protectors. At 9:30 a.m, Hamilton parked his van near to a telegraph pole and cut the wires, I assumed to stop calls to the police. He then armed himself and walked around to the front of the school. This map showed his route. It's clear that he knew exactly where he was going, with his ultimate destination being the gym at the back of the school. In the gym, just starting their PE lesson, was teacher Gwen Mayer and her 28 Year 1 pupils, aged between 5 and 6 years old. Also in the room were PE teacher Eileen Harold and Mary Blake, a teaching assistant. When Hamilton reached the gym, he began to fire rapidly and randomly aiming at anything that moved. Eileen Harold and Mary Blake were both shot, but they survived and managed to barricade themselves in a store cupboard with several wounded children. Gwen Mayer was shot and killed instantly whilst trying to protect the children. Hamilton fired 29 shots, killing one child instantly and wounding several others. He then fired another 14 shots before approaching wounded children and firing 16 point-blank shots into them. An 11-year-old pupil was walking around the outside of the gym when he heard screaming and loud bangs. The child looked in and Hamilton fired at him, missing him, but the child was injured with flying glass before he ran away. Hamilton then fired 24 shots in various directions, including targeting people who were walking or running past. Hamilton then left the gym and fired another 4 rounds towards the library, hitting and injuring another member of staff. Hamilton was standing in an area surrounded by classrooms, and he fired 9 bullets into a room of 11-year-olds who were cowering on the floor with their teacher. 1 bullet hit a chair where a child had been sitting just seconds before. Hamilton then walked back into the gym, took out one of the revolvers he was carrying, put it in his mouth, and pulled the trigger, killing himself instantly. The massacre lasted between 3 to 4 minutes, during which time Hamilton had fired approximately 100 rounds of ammunition, which killed 1 adult and 15 children instantly, with a further one dying on the way to hospital. He also injured 15 others, the majority of these being children. Emergency services were on the scene quickly, and those who could be saved were rushed to hospital. The news spread quickly, and terrified parents descended on Dunblane Primary School, hoping that their children were not amongst the dead. I cannot imagine the horror that the emergency services must have witnessed on that day, and the devastation of the parents of these children, who had likely only seen them an hour before, and were having to come to terms with the fact that their angels had been murdered in a place they should have felt completely safe. I want to talk about the victims of this horrific event, but refuse to mention the name of this piece of shit in the section where I'm going to do this. I refuse to sully their memory by mentioning his name in any sentence where I mention theirs, so I'm doing this bit first. I've already outlined the broad strokes of the man I believe Thomas Hamilton was: a paedophile, narcissist, who believed he should be allowed to do whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. A deranged, self-absorbed loser whose one benefit to society was removing himself from it. Weirdly, I misspelt the word narcissist when writing this script, and the spelling suggestion was Antichrist. I wouldn't disagree with this characterization. Hamilton clearly believed that society needed to pay for how they'd apparently treated him, and he targeted children, I believe, knowing full well that there is no greater loss to a parent than losing their child, and this was his twisted way at getting back at society, by murdering children who had done nothing to him, had no idea who he was, and who had barely started their lives. There is something so evil and psychopathic in Hamilton's actions, with him knowing full well that there would be defenseless 5- and 6-year-old children in that gym, and planning their slaughter, including standing over them while they were injured and shooting them at point-blank range. Thomas Hamilton was a coward, shown not only by his actions but also by the fact he killed himself. This seems to be the eventual actions of most mass shooters, and I believe it's the ultimate fuck you to society. It's them saying, look at what I've done, and now I'm going to leave you without any answers and no peace. I go out on my terms. The truth is, these cowards are too weak to take responsibility for their actions, knowing they could not justify the unjustifiable and would rot in prison, reviled by society. I'm not overly religious, but for Hamilton, I hope there is a hell, and he will be tormented for the rest of eternity. Please feel free to give me your thoughts on the mind and motivations of Thomas Hamilton. The nation was in shock as a result of the massacre at Dunblane Primary School, and it understandably dominated the headlines for weeks. Changes were made quickly in the aftermath, including a ban on private ownership of handguns, and the gym where the children and their teachers died was torn down. I remember the day this happened and the days afterwards. Although I was only young, I knew that this was something really bad, an example of pure evil. I remember specifically that there was a prayer published in one of the newspapers with all the names of the children and their teacher that died, and I said that prayer every day for months afterwards, hoping that God would hear me. I don't remember all of it, but 26 years later, I still recall how it ended, with it saying, "Safe with Jesus, safe above. Please accept our nation's love." Now, as I did back then, I want to say each of their names, and I want to show you pictures of each of them, showing you the beautiful children they were, so that they are remembered. Gwen Mayer, age 45 years old, the teacher who tried to protect her children. Abigail McLellan, age 5. Victoria Clydesdale, age 5. Sophie North, age 5. Ross Irvine, aged 5. Mari McBeath, aged 5. Marissa Curry, aged 5. Megan Turner, aged 5. Kevin Hassel, aged 5. John Petrie, aged 5. Joanna Ross, aged 5. Hannah Scott, aged 5. Emma Crozier, aged 5. Emily Morton, aged 5. David Kerr, aged 5. Charlotte Dunn, aged 5. Brett McKinnon, aged 6 years old. Luis Garavito, also known as La Bestia, the Beast, is a Colombian serial killer who between 1992 and 1997 murdered at least 140 children. However, it's believed he killed between 300 to 400, making him the most prolific serial killer in modern history. By the time he began his rampage, he'd already raped and tortured hundreds of children. His crimes were truly horrific and characterized by rape and sickening acts of torture. Garavito is a sexual sadist and psychopath whose life was solely devoted to the sexual violation and murder of children. A remorseless monster, his crimes and the subsequent punishment will astound and sicken you. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Luis Alfredo Garavito was born in Genova, Colombia, on the 25th of January 1957 to Manuel and Rosa. He was one of 7 children. Almost everything we know of Garavito's childhood comes from his own accounts, and unfortunately, due to him, like other serial killers, appearing to be a pathological liar, it's difficult to know what is true about him and what are lies, as some of his statements clearly contradict themselves and do not gel with official records. However, what he has said is that his father was an alcoholic who was physically and emotionally abusive towards all the members of the family. He would also have multiple affairs. With regards to his mother, Garavito described her as a violent disciplinarian who showed her children no affection and appeared to have no real interest in them. Garavito recalled an incident where he was apparently tied to a tree by his father and beaten when he was only 6 or 7 years old for defending his mother. Garavito also claimed his father would sexually abuse him and his siblings. News articles I've read from Colombia appear to indicate that Garavito's mother was a prostitute and that he and his siblings would see her having sex with various clients. Garavito's claimed to run away at the age of 8 years old and, soon after this, was targeted by a paedophile who raped him. He reports to have then joined a street gang for protection. However, it's also reported, and this seems more credible, that Garavito remained in the family home until the age of at least 10 or 11 years old, and this is based on him attending school until this age. In school, Garavito was described as a keen student, but he had difficulty learning and was mocked by his peers as being simple. He was also ridiculed due to his physical appearance, including the fact he wore thick glasses. This seemed to lead Garavito to withdraw into himself. He would play on his own, and become more and more aggressive, lashing out violently when bullied and belittled. According to him, Garavito was apparently forbidden from having friends by his father, so he was isolated both at home and at school, and subjected to and witnessed to horrific acts of abuse. Garavito apparently left school in or around 1968 in order to get work, to earn money for the family who lived on the poverty line. Garavito claimed that the next year he began being repeatedly abused by a drugstore worker who was a friend of his father's. Garavito claimed that he was raped, burnt, and cut by this individual, but nothing was done to stop this. Garavito also claimed that this abuse left him suicidal, but rather than killing himself, he found that killing and skinning animals, in particular birds, gave him a sense of relief and a feeling of power when he felt utterly powerless. By the time he was a teenager, it supported that Garavito's demeanour had changed entirely. He was now morose, withdrawn, and resentful towards society, with him acting as though he was, quote, ready to take revenge on the world. He was also now very aggressive, prone to explosive acts of violence when he felt aggrieved or did not get his own way. Around this time, so around the age of 12 to 13 years old, Garavito began molesting his siblings, forcing them to sleep naked with him, where he would touch them and get them to touch him. Around this time, Garavito stated that he was also molesting young boys in the area, including a 6-year-old neighbour. In 1971, so when he was around 14 years old, Garavito stated he was raped again by a man who had shown him pornography. By the age of 15 years old, Garavito was showing signs of a proclivity towards acts of extreme sexual violence, of an attempt to initiate sexual contact with girls who would reject his advances, to which he would respond with violence. However, Garavito continued to predominantly molest little boys and was briefly kicked out of the family home this year when he was caught trying to rape a 5-year-old boy he had lured off the streets. Garavito's first brush with the law came when he was 16 years old, when he sexually assaulted a 6-year-old boy at a station in Bogota. This child screamed, alerting passers-by, and Garavito was arrested. Garavito was accused of attempted rape, but it appears when he said that his only intention was to, quote, lightly molest the boy, he was released without charge. His father's only issue with his son's behaviour was that he'd sexually assaulted a boy and not a girl. Garavito did form relationships with some women, but when he drank, he became a monster and would physically abuse his partners, showing extreme sexual jealousy, and this led to relationships ending and him wearing out his welcome in towns and cities before moving on to the next place, with the pattern repeating over and over again. He seemed drawn to women with children, and he later claimed this was because he wanted a ready-made family and to have a wife and children that he could look after. Considering that he was a prolific paedophile, I've no doubt that he began these relationships to get access to the children. As personal relationships broke down, Garavito would become more angry, which meant he drank more, meaning he was more violent, meaning more relationships would break down, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Garavito would abuse children, either those he dragged off the streets, or he would sometimes engage the services of child prostitutes and rape them, knowing they would be unlikely to go to the police. Garavito was a prolific child molester, and initially, he let his victims live, and the level of violence used was far less extreme than the horrific nature of his later crimes. In approximately 1979, when Garavito was aged around 22 years old, he attacked a child called William, who was 9 years old at the time. Years later, William described the attack, with him stating he was walking to play with his friends when he was grabbed by Garavito from behind, and then, quote, he showed me a machete and told me, "Don't make noise, don't scream, don't do anything because I'll kill you." He told me to take off my shirt, he took off my pants, then he started kissing me, horrible, all over my body. He would take my penis and suck it, and kiss my mouth. He took my tongue and sucked it too hard to tear it off, and told me, "This is how you have to do it to me." Garavito then took William to a house and abused him for the next 5 hours, including performing oral sex on him, making William do this to him, whilst also beating him. Eventually, William was able to escape and run away. Similarly, in around 1991, Garavito approached 10-year-old Carlos Alberto in Quindío, a region in the west of Colombia. The pair walked to a secluded area, with Garavito being very amenable, but suddenly, He pulled out a knife and held its Carlos's throat, before tying him up, raping him, and torturing him. Carlos was only able to survive because he convinced Garavito that he enjoyed the abuse, which led to Garavito stating, quote, "See you next week. That's how I like it. That you also like it." Whilst abusing children, Garavito was showing signs of significant mental illness, including psychotic episodes, i.e. breaks from reality. He apparently wrote the names of the children he abused in a notebook and then prayed for them whilst beating his chest, whilst naked, in some sort of strange ritual. He would also obsessively read the Bible and also had an interest in the occult. Garavito would apparently have bouts of depression due to feelings of guilt for his crimes and would wake up in tears before breaking out into laughter, remembering the sexual pleasure he got from their suffering. This is according to his own words, and once I think the laughter is true, I have no doubt that any statements of remorse or guilt are lies. Garavito would move around Colombia, and wherever he went, there was a spike in the number of children who were molested. Garavito was a methodical and cunning offender. He would specifically target homeless children, orphan boys living in the streets who were just looking for money and food. Garavito would offer them both, and for children who had addictions to alcohol and drugs, he would offer them their next fix. He would also pose as different people and would wear various costumes, with him disguising himself as a priest, a street vendor, and an elderly man offering these children jobs or asking them for help around the house in exchange for room and board. Garavito would never appear in the same disguise too often in order to avoid suspicion. The whole point of this routine was to lure children away from populated areas, with Garavito often walking them long distances in order to tire them out so they would be able to fight back. Then he would attack them. Throughout the 1980s, the savagery of Garavito's abuse of children became more extreme. He would burn, rape, cut, and stab the children, often torturing them for hours whilst they were tied up and screaming. During this same period, he also spent time in psychiatric hospitals after attempting suicide on several occasions and displaying signs of acute mental illness. This included a period of 5 years according to police reports. So this period of 12 years can be reduced down to 7 years, meaning that on average, Garavito was molesting 2 children a month, but this figure is likely much higher. By 1992, I think that Luis Garavito was not getting the same high from raping and torturing children, and he began a campaign of murder which would claim the lives of hundreds of little boys across Colombia. According to Garavito, in the middle of 1992, he was using a Ouija board when he began communicating with the devil, who asked whether he wished to serve him. Garavito said he then made a pact with the devil, who commanded him to kill as many children as possible. Garavito's first attempted murder apparently occurred on the 1st of October 1992, when he approached a child selling sweets and cigars in the streets of Bolivar, an area in the north of Colombia. Garavito lured this boy to a secluded area and began to attack him, but was interrupted by passers-by and then beaten by the police. Just 3 days later, on the 4th of October 1992, Garavito claimed his first victim, 13-year-old Juan Carlos, who he lured to a secluded area with the promise of paid work. Once there, Garavito raped Juan and used a butcher knife he had recently purchased to slice his throat and cut off his penis. The floodgates opened after this first killing, and Garavito engaged on a campaign of rape and murder across Colombia over the next 7 years, including claiming his second victim within 6 days. This time he raped and murdered a 6-year-old boy. Few children escaped from Garavito, but those that survived give us an insight into the depravity of this man. One such child was Brand Alvarez, who was 16 years old when he was attacked by Garavito in the mid-1990s. Brand and his father worked in cockfighting, and, whilst his father tended to the birds, Brand was lured to a secluded area. Garavito then threatened him with a knife, bound him, raped him, and tortured him, including stabbing him 7 times with a screwdriver. As Garavito progressed in his killing spree, his crimes became increasingly more heinous and sadistic. Please be warned, I'm going to give a rundown of the things he did to his victims, so please, if you don't want to hear this, then skip through the video until you can no longer see this warning. As a sexual sadist, Garavito would often rape and torture the children at the same time. as it appears that violence was the only way he could become aroused and achieve orgasm. He would walk the children long distances so they would get tired and were unable to resist, at which point he would typically tie them up and stab them, either with a knife or a screwdriver, in areas that wouldn't immediately kill them, but would cause them significant pain, including their hands, feet, and buttocks. Garavito would also use knife blades, held between his fingers, to whip the children and flay the skin from their bodies, as well as cutting off their toes and fingers. Garavito would sometimes cut the child's bellies open so their intestines would fall out of their body, and during all of this torture, he would anally rape them. Garavito's victims were almost always found with deep bite marks on their bodies. He would also cut off the boys' penises when they were still alive. Garavito would ultimately kill the children through a variety of methods, most commonly cutting their throat with a knife, but he would also sometimes stab the children to death, in some cases over 100 times, and, on other occasions, he would decapitate the children while they were conscious. As a final indignity, he would often place the severed penises of his victims into their mouths. Garavito would also have sex with the children's bodies after they had died. Then, he would simply leave the children's bodies naked where he killed them and walk off. Garavito would often be drunk when killing the children, and brandy bottles were found at many of the crime scenes. Garavito is believed to have raped and murdered boys in approximately 54 towns across Colombia. Within each town, he would molest and murder multiple children, having selected a secluded site to lure them to, creating mass graves in many areas that he visited. For example, he lured 8 boys aged between 9 to 11 years old from a local school in La Victoria district of Colombia. He would lure each one to a wooded area before raping and murdering them. I can only imagine the horror these children went through in their final moments, and probably they were taken to a secluded area, and the last thing they saw was probably the bodies of other murdered children, and they knew at that point there was no escape. Garavito's whole life was devoted to the rape and murder of young boys. It was all he was focused on, and he was prolific. For example, in 1993 alone, he sought to have murdered at least 20 children, and each year, the frequency of his killings increased. Garavito did come close to being caught on more than one occasion during his killing spree, including on June the 8th, 1996, when a boy went missing in the town of Boyaca in North Colombia. 5 days later, his decapitated corpse was found in a wooded area with his severed penis in his mouth. The boy's mother discovered her son had been seen with a stranger in a local shop. This man was identified as Luis Garavito, and he was questioned by police. He admitted that he'd seen the boy, bought him sweets because he felt sorry for him, and then they parted ways. The police apparently believed Garavito, and he was released. He realized he needed to relocate and move to a nearby town where, 4 days later, he raped and murdered a 13-year-old boy. Garavito would collect trophies, specifically would take the photo IDs of some of his victims and would carry them around in a bag. He would hide these with girlfriends of his, and he would also document his crimes in the journal. However, eventually, Garavito's killing spree would be brought to an end, but not before he claimed the lives of hundreds of children. All through the 1990s, authorities had suspicions they had a serial killer operating in Colombia due to the number of missing children and their bodies being found with signs of sexual torture and all being bound in similar manners with nylon rope. However, authorities began to pay real attention when on the 7th of November 1998, in an isolated area of the city of Pereira, a mass grave was uncovered which held the corpses of between 25 and 36 young boys. All of the bodies showed signs of being bound, sexually assaulted and tortured. Another mass grave, this time contained the bodies of 41 children, was also found in the area of Risaralda. Then, a further 27 bodies were found in a mass grave in the neighbouring region of Valle de Cauca. So that is approximately 100 bodies of murdered children. Authorities began investigating, but it was a mistake that Garavito made in February 1999, which ultimately sealed his fate. Specifically, on the 6th of February 1999, the bodies of 2 children were found on a hillside near a sugarcane field outside the city of Palmira in southwest Colombia. A day later, a 3rd body was found. All 3 children had been bound, raped, and tortured. The cane field these children were found in had been destroyed by fire. Garavito, whilst in a drunken state, had fallen asleep with a lit cigarette on top of the children's bodies and had set the field on fire by accident, almost killing himself. In his panic to escape, he left behind money, his glasses, and a note containing the address of his girlfriend. The girlfriend was spoken to, and she handed the police a bag. In the bag was Garavito's ledger and his trophies, the photographs of the dead children. The police knew they had their man. However, finding Garavito was a different matter. It was quite clear he was going to continue to kill as many children as possible until he was stopped. With this in mind, on the 22nd of April 1999, Garavito targeted his last victim, 12-year-old John Ivan Sabogal. Garavito was drinking brandy in the evening when he came across John selling lottery tickets in the city of Villavicencio. Garavito claimed he was a local politician and approached John. He then threatened him with a knife and marched John to an isolated hillside and, after binding him, screamed, quote, "Am I a sadist?" whilst masturbating over him. A 16-year-old homeless boy intervened and began to throw stones at Garavito, giving John the chance to slip his bindings. Garavito chased both boys into the woods, and the police were called. Garavito was arrested coming out of the woods. He was unable to find either child. When in police custody, Garavito quickly confessed to killing 140 children, and this bizarre video shows the moment of that confession. No! The police were not satisfied with just a confession, and they sought concrete evidence of Garavito's guilt, and this was in abundance. His DNA was found all over the crime scenes, including on the bodies of his victims, but also on alcohol bottles found at the scenes. Also, Garavito took police around the country to the mass graves of the children he murdered. How many bodies were actually recovered varies between sources, but it appears the remains of at least 138 children were discovered. Many of these were skeletonized, having been murdered years before. I found very few pictures of the victims. However, these are the faces of a very small fraction of the children that Garavito violated and then horrifically murdered. Luis Garavito was charged with 172 murders throughout Colombia, and he was found guilty of 138 of these. On May the 27th, 2000, he was sentenced to 1,853 years in prison. However, this sentence was essentially meaningless, as, at the time of his sentence, Colombian law stated the longest someone could spend in prison was 40 years. I believe, from what I've read, that the reason for this is that the original Colombian constitution prohibited imprisonment for life. I'm unsure if that's true, and if it is, what thinking underpinned this, as it leaves a massive loophole where people can kill 1 or 1 million and there's no difference in their sentence. That's a really weird decision. However, and it gets worse, due to Garavito helping authorities recover the bodies of his victims, his sentence was further reduced to 22 years, meaning that, as of 2023, Luis Garavito is eligible for parole. This sentence and situation is ridiculous, but even more so when it's pointed out that, since his conviction, Garavito has confessed to approximately 210 murders and is widely believed to have actually killed between 300 and 400 children in Colombia, but also in Ecuador and Venezuela, making him the most prolific serial killer in modern history. Before talking about the psychological profile of Luis Garavito, but talking about his time in prison, I want to outline why he was able to get away with his crimes for so long. Specifically, Luis Garavito was born into a country that was in a state of chaos due to the Colombian Civil War, which thought its state officially started in 1964, but there appears to have been armed conflict in the country since the 1940s. From what I understand, this conflict is still ongoing and involves various groups fighting for control over territories in Colombia as well as the country as a whole. This includes government forces, far-right and far-left paramilitary organizations, and crime syndicates. Most seem to claim that they are fighting for the people. Others are clearly intent on controlling the drug trade. It seems that the people who have suffered the most in these conflicts have been the civilians. Sources state that 260,000 people have been killed in this conflict up to 2018, with a staggering 208,000 of these being civilians not involved in the conflict. Horrific atrocities are being committed by all groups involved in the conflict, including mass executions, with the victims being buried in mass graves, kidnappings, rapes, dismemberment of live victims, as well as other horrors. As an example, a news report from 2015 outlines how government forces have destroyed dozens of, quote, chop houses in and around the coastal city of Buenaventura, which are placed where people were taken and dismembered. Despite the removal of these so-called chop houses, for years after 2015, it wasn't unusual for body parts to wash up on the shore. It appears that atrocities such as the murder and rapes of children were just attributed to part of this conflict and are seemed to have been committed by groups rather than an individual person. Even if they suspected something different, it's quite clear the government forces were too heavily invested in the armed conflict to actually investigate any crimes committed against the common people. In addition to this, Colombia has an extremely high number of so-called street children who are often orphans who have no one looking out for them and no one to even report them missing. It's this environment which enabled Luis Garavito to kill and kill again, but also two other Colombian serial killers, Pedro Lopez and Daniel Barbosa. Between them, these three men killed at least 300 children between about 1969 and 1992, but this could be as many as 700 to 900 children, which is just an insane number and truly horrifying. I've covered some of the most evil and soulless individuals on this channel, but in my opinion, Luis Garavito sits on top of this pile. This is not just because of the number of his victims, but also the sheer depravity of his crimes and his continued unwillingness to take responsibility for his actions and his frankly perverse statements made during interviews whilst in prison. As a starting point, I want to play a few-second clip from an interview with Garavito, which I think is from 2016, or it may be slightly earlier. Jag är ingen nabo med siet. Kakakari indroli kero på her. Jag nekere jag bidde kero jag milt de levendo ni almaldio. I play this to demonstrate how Garrett Totes is still leaning on the devil maybe do it defense. This is classic distancy language. It was me, but it wasn't me. Someone else made me do it. Sorry. But let's look at the difference between Garavito and an individual who is truly mentally unwell and committed their crimes due to bizarre beliefs. Specifically, Richard Chase. Richard Chase murdered 6 people in the space of a month between 1977 and 1978 in Sacramento, California. He had delusional beliefs, with him believing he needed to drink the blood of his victims in order to cure his ill health. His victims were randomly chosen, his crime scenes chaotic, with him making no effort to cover up his crimes, leaving fingerprints and footprints at his crime scenes. Chase was completely disconnected from reality. He acted on pure delusion. It was as if the rules of society meant nothing to him. However, let's look at Garavito. He was a calculating and to a great extent organized offender. He targeted children he knew would not be missed, used various disguises and ruses in order to gain access to his victims, and took them to pre-selected locations in order to torture, rape and kill them, knowing he wouldn't be disturbed. This was a man fully in control, a man solely focused on fulfilling his sick sexual fantasies. Maybe Garavito's convinced himself that the devil did make him do it, but he doesn't recognize Satan looking back at him when he stares into the mirror. Instead, I believe that Luis Garavito is the epitome of a sadistic sexual psychopath. He gains sexual gratification from engaging in ever more depraved acts, which were clearly fully intended to cause these children as much pain as possible for as long as possible. It's clear that he could only gain erection and achieve orgasm from the pain and humiliation of others. I've read somewhere that Garavito was apparently sorry for his crimes and would pray for his victims. Absolute bollocks. This is something that Garavito has claimed, but it's rubbish. This man is a psychopath. He doesn't have the capacity to feel remorse for his actions or compassion for any human being. He couldn't, given the horrific things he did to these children. Their last moments must have been characterised by fear, absolute horror, and indescribable pain. Garavito subjected hundreds of children to this horrific fate. His pathetic wailing when he finally confessed to his crimes, I have no doubt, was to try and portray himself as remorseful, and his stories about his childhood, which seemed to chop and change, I think were made to try and portray himself as a victim. I have no doubt there is some truth in Garavito's statements about his childhood. He likely was raised in a house of violence, and, given the situation in Colombia at the time, he likely saw absolute horrors outside the family home. These experiences inevitably shaped his attitudes and beliefs, but lots of people have truly horrific childhoods, but they don't go on to murder hundreds of children. A deprived or traumatic childhood is not an excuse to harm others. You have a choice. Garavito had a choice, and he decided to destroy the lives of innocent children, rip their bodies apart, and dispose of them like rubbish. I think in his own mind, whilst Garavito knows that society frowns on what he did, he doesn't really think he's done anything wrong. As if to reinforce his point, and seriously brace yourself, during his time in prison, Garavito has stated his intention to become a politician and to be an advocate for children's rights and to work on legislation to protect children. I mean, what the fuck? That'd be like letting a paedophile run a daycare or making an arsonist a fireman, but I don't know. Luis Garavito is currently 66 years old and apparently has advanced eye cancer. However, I have no doubt, even with his poor health, if he was released tomorrow, he would kill the day after and keep killing for as long as he draws breath. I pray to God that the Colombian authorities find a way to keep this man in prison forever. He is, in my opinion, the epitome of evil. This case is truly sickening, and I'm sure you'll agree that this man, Jordan Monaghan, is pure evil. The reason for this is that Monaghan is a British serial killer who ended the lives of 2 of his 3 children between 2013 and 2016. One of them was just 28 days old. Monaghan also unsuccessfully tried to do the same to his 3rd child on 2 occasions. Whilst under investigation for these offences, Monaghan began a relationship with a woman, Evie Adams, who he abused and eventually killed in 2019 by poisoning her. All the while, Monaghan never showed any remorse for his crimes and continued to live his life as normal until he was finally revealed to be the monster that he was. Welcome to Evil Among Us. There's little information about Jordan Monaghan's early life, but it appears he was born in 1991, either in or around the town of Blackburn in the county of Lancashire, UK, approximately 20 miles northwest of Manchester. While still a teenager, Monaghan began a relationship with a girl of the same age, called Laura Gray, and in November 2008, so when he was around 17 years old, Monaghan and Laura became engaged. Almost exactly 3 years later, on November the 17th, 2011, the pair welcomed their first child into the world, Logan, a happy and healthy baby boy. However, there were already issues in the relationship due to Monaghan's chronic gambling addiction, with him racking up thousands of pounds of debt on multiple credit cards and blowing all of his wages as soon as he received them. This meant the family were in significant financial difficulty, bills were unpaid, and they were in dire straits. On the 23rd of September 2012, the situation came to a head, and Laura, by now pregnant with the pair's 2nd child, told Monaghan the relationship was over. After having this conversation, Laura went on a shopping trip and then received a call from Monaghan saying that Logan had been rushed to hospital due to a suspected paracetamol overdose due to him finding Logan playing next to a pack which had some tablets missing. Laura, beside herself with worry, rushed to the hospital to be at Logan's bedside. However, when she got to the hospital, it transpired that no drugs were found in Logan's system. It had been a false alarm. Laura felt that Monaghan had just been overly cautious due to his love for their son, and this incident and his response appeared to pave over the cracks in the relationship temporarily. However, this incident was the beginning of a sick and twisted game played by Monaghan, using his own children like chess pieces in order to manipulate Laura into staying with him, but also, I believe, punishing her for daring to suggest ending the relationship. The pair welcomed their 2nd child, Ruby, on December the 8th, 2012. Laura later said that the family had the, quote, best Christmas ever after Ruby was born, and, quote, I felt like the luckiest mum in the world with my own little family. It was all I'd ever wanted. I was determined to give my children everything I never had. However, tensions continue within the relationship, with Monaghan continuing to gamble, blowing all the money he earned, whilst racking up debts and contributing nothing to the household. This led to Laura again threatening to end the relationship, and it seems that Monaghan felt he needed to escalate his behaviour to create a situation where Laura would be so utterly devastated that her focus would be redirected and she would forget about ending the relationship and would ultimately look to him for support. So he decided to murder the children. On the 28th of December 2012, Ruby, aged 20 days old, was taken to hospital due to difficulty breathing. She was diagnosed as suffering from bronchitis and stayed in hospital until the 31st of December 2012, when she was allowed home. Literally, just a few hours later, in the early hours of January the 1st, 2013, Laura was woken up by Monaghan, who said that Ruby had stopped breathing. Laura stated, quote, I ran downstairs and I could see, the moment I looked at her, that she was gone. Laura was unfortunately correct. An ambulance was called, but there was nothing that could be done. And so, baby Ruby, aged just 28 days old, was pronounced dead at 2:45 a.m. The cause of death was determined to have been due to bronchitis. However, the truth is that Monaghan had smothered Ruby in her Moses basket whilst Laura was asleep. Monaghan had clearly ensured that she was dead before waking Laura, meaning that his pathetic and disgusting pantomime of performing CPR on his daughter was just a performance likely to make him seem like a father desperately trying to save his daughter's life rather than the one who had taken it. Laura fell to pieces after the death of her daughter and relied heavily on Monaghan to get through this grief, with him taking care of the funeral arrangements and generally being her rock. Of course, the focus became on trying to come to terms with the death of their daughter, and the issues in the relationship seemed to evaporate. Laura later stated, quote, he just carried on, but again, I just thought that he was being strong for me. I didn't suspect a thing. We focused on Logan because he was all we had left. Jordan had a really close relationship with his son. However, again, the same pattern re-emerged, and Monaghan continued to gamble, resulting in tensions in the relationship. On the 16th of August 2013, Laura again had had enough of Monaghan and told him the relationship was over. The next day, the 17th of August 2013, Monaghan said he wanted to take their son Logan, now aged 21 months, swimming. Monaghan took Logan to Waves Water Fun Centre in Blackburn, but neither of them actually went swimming. In the changing rooms, Monaghan suffocated Logan. Then, in an act of ultimate depravity, he secured his son's dead body into his buggy, covered it with a rain cover, and wheeled it home. Claimed that Logan was asleep and that Laura should wake him up before he went out to get pizza. Laura said that, as soon as she lifted the rain cover, she knew Logan was dead. She called Monaghan in a frantic state, and he rushed home and again made a show of performing CPR on the child he had murdered. However, Logan was beyond saving and was pronounced dead. His cause of death was determined to be inconclusive. Laura was so distraught that she had to be admitted to a psychiatric facility. However, Monaghan came to visit her every day, and she leaned on him exclusively to try and get through a parent's worst nightmare. The support led them to rekindle their relationship, and again, all his financial recklessness was forgotten. Sickeningly, after the death of Logan, Monaghan gave at least one interview to the press in which he stated, quote, it's been like a bad dream, and we expect to wake up at any moment. You never get over losing a child, but we were just starting to move on and then Logan dies. You always expect your children to outlive you, and don't think you'll have to plan their funeral. But we had to do it twice in 8 months. It's heartbreaking. He also complained that police were treating him and Laura like criminals. The couple's third child, a daughter, was born in May 2016. It appears that this child, who cannot be named for legal reasons, was again harmed by Monaghan, but thankfully survived despite his best efforts. Specifically, at the girls' christening on the 18th of September 2016, Laura caught Monaghan using a fruit machine, and this led to an argument where she said she would leave him. On the 27th of September 2016, Monaghan was alone with his daughter when he shouted to Laura that she'd stop breathing. An ambulance was called, but the child appeared to recover on their own. On the 2nd of October 2016, their daughter again suffered another apparent respiratory episode whilst alone with Monaghan. She spent 9 days recovering, but no cause for her sudden illness was found in the hospital. Later, it was proven that Monaghan had suffocated his daughter on each of these occasions, attempting to murder her. After this last incident, the relationship between Laura and Monaghan broke down permanently, and I've read alternatively that Laura was given full custody of their third child, but also read that they were taken into care. Either way, Monaghan had no access to his daughter, inevitably saving her life. The deaths of 2 children and the serious illness of another within the same household led to serious concerns amongst professionals, but it was not until January 2018, almost 5 years after the children's deaths, that investigations between the police and medical professionals determined the most likely cause of these incidents was deliberate obstruction of the children's airways. It was then not until April the 13th, 2018, that Jordan Monaghan was arrested on suspicion of murder and attempted murder. This clip shows part of the interview, specifically related to the death of Logan.
You're under arrest, obviously, on suspicion of the attempt murder of Logan. That's for instance on the 27th of the 7th, 2013. That's attempt and the murder on the 17th of the 8th, 2013. Okay?
Yeah.
It sounds it was before. You're responsible for either of those 2 offences?
No.
But he was away when you left Wales?
It was, no. Not when I left.
He wasn't awake? When did he fall asleep?
Just as we was coming out of Wales.
The police didn't have enough evidence to charge Monaghan, and he was released on bail. However, it appears they kept a close eye on him. This included reaching out to women that he tried to start relationships with, informing them that he was a dangerous man. Unfortunately, this did not stop Monaghan from forming a relationship with a woman called Evie Adams in early 2018, when she was just 22 years old. Evie Adams did not have the best start in life, being removed from an abusive household with her brother when she was young, with both children being the victims of violence and neglect. When she was around 7 years old, the fostering agency called Yvonne Adams and asked if she and her husband Bernard would take the children, to which they agreed, and the pair never left, being loved by Bernard and Yvonne as if they were their own children, and 3 years after first arriving, they were both adopted. At the age of 16 years old, Evie took their surname, cementing her place as their daughter. Around the same time, Evie moved out and began a relationship with her first serious boyfriend, Nathan. And when Evie was around 19 years old, she became pregnant with her first child, a daughter. Unfortunately, she suffered postnatal depression after the birth, and this put a strain on her relationship with Nathan, and they separated, but they would co-parent their daughter, with her spending certain days with her father at his property. However, it appears that Evie was lonely and didn't wish to raise her daughter alone, and she began looking online for a new partner. In early 2018, Evie and Jordan Monaghan met through Tinder and began a relationship. Monaghan sought to control and isolate Evie almost immediately, telling her not to inform people that the pair were together, with her family only finding out because they heard local gossip about the fact he'd been seen at her house. Her parents and friends were concerned, as Monaghan was believed, within the local community, correctly, to be a child murderer, and they begged Evie to end the relationship, but tragically, she dismissed their concerns. Monaghan started to sever connections that Evie had with support, including her friends and also her former partner Nathan, with him threatening to burn down his house if he carried on contacting Evie, and that he didn't care if the pair's daughter was in the property when this happened. However, Evie quickly fell under his spell, taken in by Monaghan's charm, being made to feel special and no longer alone. Monaghan subtly chipped away at Evie's self-esteem, reminding her that she'd been abused as a child and therefore somehow damaged, and that she would not be able to find anyone else if they were not together. The police and social services entered the scene almost immediately, with the police warning Evie the danger she and her daughter were in, as well as taking her to a place of safety. Social services basically gave Evie a choice of being with Monaghan or having her daughter removed from her care, and she initially appeared to agree to stop seeing him, and a restraining order was imposed in May 2018, prohibiting Monaghan from having contact with Evie. However, Monaghan ignored this order, and the pair kept having contact, leading to him breaching the order repeatedly, including in June 2018, December 2018, and March 2019. He appeared in front of the courts for each of these breaches, and eventually went to prison for 12 weeks after the last breach. However, it's clear that he had no intention of relinquishing control over Evie. Due to the continued contact between the pair, in early 2019 Evie lost custody of her daughter, with the child being removed due to concerns that Monaghan would harm or kill them. Evie was devastated, and while she still had regular supervised contact with her daughter, it clearly wasn't the same. By mid-2019, it appears Evie was looking for a way out of the relationship with Monaghan and wanted to make changes so that she could have her daughter returned to her care. With the help of services, Evie was able to gain a place in a women's refuge in Kendal, approximately 50 miles away. The locations of women's refuges are closely guarded secrets for obvious reasons, as these women are often escaping from men who, if they could track them down, would likely kill them. However, Monaghan found Evie's location quickly, likely due to tracking her phone, and she contacts a friend telling her that Monaghan was following her around everywhere she went. She was advised to call the police, but she didn't want to get Monaghan into further trouble. However, despite all attempts, Monaghan would find a way to continue to slither his way back into Evie's life. By October 2019, the pair were back in a relationship, but it appears that Evie was fighting back, showing defiance of Monaghan's control, which led to more frequent arguments. The tipping point appears to have come over the weekend of the 11th to the 13th of October 2019, when Monaghan, Evie and some friends went to stay in a caravan in Blackpool. Monaghan didn't hide the person he was. He was rude, aggressive, intimidating, and eventually smashed up the caravan they were all staying in. When they returned back to Blackburn on the 14th of October 2019, Evie appears to have told Monaghan that the relationship was over, as she began to look for a new place to live, away from him. However, Monaghan had no intention of allowing this to happen, and, on the same day, he joined a WhatsApp group titled, quote, UK Tablets, and sent a message to buy drugs saying, quote, who's got tramadol, and asking others for, quote, pre-gabs and blues, meaning diazepam and pregabalin. Tramadol is a strong painkiller, whilst diazepam and pregabalin are medications used for a variety of conditions, but, when taken with tramadol, can cause drowsiness, sedation, and slow breathing and heart rate, potentially resulting in death. Within days, Evie's flat hunting had been placed on hold, as she was reportedly being extremely unwell. It appears that Monaghan was poisoning Evie, giving her high doses of a combination of these drugs, which has a severe and rapid impact on her body. By October the 22nd, 2019, Evie was delirious and suffering from abdominal pains. Her body was shutting down. Her breathing was also getting slower, along with her heart rate. In one of the last messages Evie sent to Monaghan on the 23rd of October 2019, she stated, quote, I feel like I'm dying. Unfortunately, she was correct, and her life was ebbing away, and it's horrific to think how scared she must have been, going from active and healthy to dying within the space of approximately 2 weeks and not knowing the reason why. On the 24th of October 2019, Evie Adams had extremely high levels of sedative in her system, was in significant pain, and was unable to walk. Monaghan then administered a fatal dose of tramadol, intended to kill her. He gave her a dosage equivalent to 20 50-milligram tramadol tablets. This dosage is approximately 3 times the amount that a doctor would usually ever prescribe of this powerful painkiller, and this, combined with the residual sedatives in her body, resulted in an overdose and her death at the age of just 23 years old. Whether Monaghan stood and watched Evie die is unclear, but it's apparent that he was taking steps to cover his tracks immediately. After administering this fatal dosage to Evie, he took her phone and went to work. He then sent himself a message from her phone, which read, quote, "I've taken the drugs. I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want help," clearly laying the groundwork to make her death look like a suicide. As with other people like Monaghan, they appear to have real difficulty in understanding how people would actually react in this situation. Because they lack normal human emotions, they act in a strange way, which actually raises suspicion. In the case of Monaghan, instead of dropping everything and running home to be with his partner, who had just texted him saying she was going to kill herself, he finished his working day and texted her aunt, asking her to check up on Evie. Evie's aunt Julie went round there and found her niece dead in bed. Given the fact that a young woman had died suddenly, the police were called and began an investigation. But, whilst they were suspicious, they could not be sure Evie's death was suspicious. It was actually Monaghan's own arrogance and stupidity which raised concerns and led police to take a closer look at him. Specifically, a few weeks after her death, in November 2019, Monaghan told police that he'd found a suicide note. This was apparently hidden in a picture frame, which he'd found when he took the photo out to apparently place in Evie's coffin. This was considered very odd, as the note, which as a suicide note was clearly intended to be read, was put in a place where it could potentially have never been found, and it was just by chance that Monaghan had happened to open that one picture frame. Also, the handwriting did not match Evie's. An autopsy established that Evie's death was due to a fatal overdose, and Monaghan was interviewed on suspicion of killing her in both October 2019 and June 2020. He denied having anything to do with her death. Unfortunately, again, the police didn't have enough evidence to charge him, and so he was released on bail. Monaghan pretended to be the grieving boyfriend, including posting this disgusting post on Facebook. So, by 2020, Jordan Monaghan was on bail, whilst the police investigated his potential involvement in the murders of 3 people. So, what did Monaghan do? He went back to his old lifestyle of gambling and drinking, and this disgusting clip from around October 2020, so a year after Evie's death, shows him apparently having the time of his life, filming himself singing along to the song Mr. Brightside by The Killers. Due to that being a copyrighted song, I can't play the sound, but you're not missing much. The breakthrough in this case came in late 2020, when the police were able to obtain Monaghan's phone, and this showed him buying the very drugs that Evie had overdosed on just before she started to become unwell. On the 17th of January 2021, the walls finally closed in on Monaghan, and he was arrested on suspicion of murdering Logan, Ruby, and Evie Adams, as well as 2 counts of attempts to murder his 3rd child. He continued to deny any involvement and, when confronted with the new evidence about the searches on his phone of him trying to source drugs, he said they were for him. He was not believed, and on the 18th of January 2021, Monaghan was charged with all offences and remanded into custody to await his day in court. Jordan Monaghan pleaded not guilty to all offences and went to trial at Preston Crown Court. This trial lasted 10 weeks, and on December the 17th, 2021, the jury found him guilty of murdering Logan and Ruby by suffocating them and Evie Adams by administering a fatal dosage of medication. He was also found guilty of 2 counts of attempted murder against his 3rd child with Laura Gray, by suffocating them. Later that same day, Monaghan stood before Mr. Justice Goose for sentencing. Justice Goose stated, quote, "It's difficult to imagine why you carried out these offences, but, having listened to the evidence in this trial, I'm sure that you are an exceptionally controlling, selfish, and cruel man." He then sentenced him. For 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, Jordan Monaghan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 40 years. On the 29th of July 2022, this was increased to a minimum of 48 years when the Court of Appeal deemed the original sentence to be too lenient. Based on this, Monaghan will be around 77 years old before he's able to apply for parole, assuming he lives that long. Concerns have been raised to the media about the handling of this case by several different agencies, including medical professionals, and their lack of, quote, professional curiosity regarding the deaths of both Logan and Ruby, with their deaths not being treated as suspicious. I've also read about a serious case review being initiated at Blackburn Council, inevitably around safeguarding, and why the family was not scrutinised more closely when the children have repeated contact with medical professionals, and why consideration wasn't given to removing the children from the home. In addition, criticism has been levelled at the speed of the police investigation, with Monaghan not being charged with the murders of his own children until 8 years later, and 3 years after a review had established that his 2 children had likely been murdered by suffocation. In response, Detective Chief Superintendent Pauline Stables stated, quote, "The deaths of both Ruby and Logan were subject to review in 2018. We gathered all the information the previous investigation filed. It's really difficult. You've got a loss of evidence from previous investigations because the deaths were treated or deemed to be natural causes. You've got medical evidence that's lost, CCTV, so it's really difficult to investigate historical crimes. Loss of evidence related to the suspicious death of 2 children. I'm not sure about you, but I find this explanation absolutely staggering. The glacial progression in this case and the lack of action by agencies meant that Jordan Monaghan was free to murder another person, a vulnerable woman whose death has devastated her family and left a daughter without a mother. Monaghan should have been safely behind bars a lot sooner, and lives would have been saved. Serious case reviews should result in a report, which can be accessed by the public. I cannot find any. Potentially they are pending, and I'll likely do an update on this video if I can get hold of them, as they often contain a lot more information, including background regarding the offender. However, even without this information, I for one am struggling to understand how a man this dangerous was allowed to walk around free for so long, free to kill again. This is one of the most horrific cases I've covered, and in order to highlight why, we need to look at why Jordan Monaghan committed these crimes. It should be pointed out that Monaghan did not admit his culpability, and the trial established his guilt, but not his motivation. So this is just my analysis, but I'm very confident I'm on the mark. So, going back to the profile of domestic abusers, these individuals often have backgrounds of trauma themselves, which results in them having low self-esteem and issues with abandonment, and they're unable to cope with the end of a relationship and or being on their own, and so they look to control their partners, eroding their self-esteem and placing them in a position, often through fear, where they feel unable to leave. Control is obtained and maintained through a variety of tactics, including violence, threats of violence, emotional abuse, isolating behaviour, etc. If they feel their control is being defied, for example, if their victim tries to leave the relationship, they will implement whatever tactics to stop this, as well as punish them for daring to consider that they have any say in the coupling. So, that is the basic template, which I found is common amongst domestic abusers. But in the case of Monaghan, there are additional factors I think need to be considered, in particular indicators of narcissism and psychopathy. Specifically, I think that Monaghan is a man who is entirely self-centered. No one else matters but him and what he wants, and, in this case, remaining in a relationship. With regards to psychopathy, I think it's obvious that he has no empathy, no compassion for others, and is willing to harm anyone, even his own children, without any regret or remorse. So, together, you have a man who is emotionally dependent on relationships and is willing to do whatever it takes in order to remain in control in these situations, even if it involves harming and killing others to get his own way. This would explain why, whenever Laura Gray tried to end a relationship, he would not have this, as I looked for some way to ensure this would not occur. He figured that the best way to do this was to create some sort of emergency which would completely redirect Laura's attention away from concerns about his behaviour, and he decided on using the one thing most precious to her, but clearly of absolutely no consequence to him, their children. So he created situations where she was in a blind panic when the children were sick, and he would then ride on this white charger, pretending to be supportive and caring, being her rock. However, he needed situations which would utterly devastate Laura, destroy her psychologically, make her look to him entirely for support, and give him further opportunities to act as the hero. In order to achieve this, he killed the children, knowing that this would cripple Laura and make her forget any intention to leave him, and give him opportunities to act as the hero, including CPR on children he knew to be already dead, and organising a funeral, etc. So, rather than taking steps to address the main issue which seemed to be causing issues in the relationship, his gambling, he thought it was a better idea to kill his own children. The absolute evil of this man is so profound, and I cannot get my head around how he could kill his own children, likely by placing his hand over their nose and mouth, watching and feeling their life ebbing away, abusing the ultimate trust that is placed in a parent by a child, and destroying the most precious gift that a person can receive in their life. These children were just pawns in his sick little game. He was no father. He's not even worthy of being referred to as a human being, in my opinion. I think there was also a form of punishment in his actions. It's sickening that he wheeled Logan home knowing he was dead, and they got Laura to lift the rain cover and see her son like that. I have no doubt Monahan was filled with glee, knowing the impact this would have on her, and he was likely thinking to himself, "So you think you can leave me? This is what happens when you try." Eventually, he formed a relationship with Evie Adams, a woman who had a history of trauma herself, who was struggling as a single mother, and who just wanted to be loved and supported. No doubt, Monahan presented himself as her saviour, and manipulated her into believing that he was the answer to all of her problems. The one positive in this case, and I use that term loosely, is that Evie's daughter was removed from her care, and this is only because I have no doubt that Monahan would have harmed or killed this child eventually. However, in the absence of anyone else, he targeted Evie directly, and, when she wanted to end the relationship, he poisoned her. Initially, I think this was to incapacitate her, making her so ill that she was entirely under his control. Why he eventually killed her is unclear, but I think that Monahan knew he could not let her recover, that if she did, she would tell the police who was giving her the pills, and it would only be a matter of time before he was arrested. She was an inconvenience and needed to be eliminated. Why Evie took the pills is also a question that remains unanswered, but I think it's important to note that during the Blackpool trip in October 2019, one of her friends noticed Monahan giving her tablets out of a bottle. I think it's likely that Monahan had already got Evie hooked on medication as a form of control, and so she would be more likely to continue taking pills he gave her, potentially due to already being addicted to them. I want to say something in this case to try and offset some potential negative comments. People may say, why did Laura or Evie not know what was going on? Or why did they not take better care of their children, etc.? I really want to stress that unless you have been in this type of situation or seen it up close, it's difficult to put into words how insidious domestic abuse is, how these men are often skilled manipulators who can change people and make them act in ways that, looking back, they may be completely disgusted by. Even if you think both women potentially should or could have acted differently, I don't think that anything that either of them did meant that one should lose their life at the age of 23 years old and the other one had to spend the rest of her life mourning her two children. Nothing they did or didn't do meant they deserved that. So, please be respectful of these women. Do not lose focus that this monster, Jordan Monahan, is the ultimate cause of this, May he rot in prison and then, hopefully, in the depths of hell. On another note, I want to highlight support services if you need to talk to someone about domestic abuse. In the UK, a great place to start for advice and help, especially with escaping an abusive relationship, is to call the National Domestic Abuse Helpline 24 hours a day on 0808 2000 24/7. Also, Women's Aid is an amazing organisation that offers advice and practical support, and they can be found at www.womensaid, all one word, .org.uk. The website has lots of information, as well as a live chat function, which is active between 8 AM and 6 PM Monday to Friday, and 10 AM to 6 PM at the weekend. There's an option you can click on the website, which quickly takes you to a Google home screen if you need to hide what you're doing from your abuser. In the US, call the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence on 1-800-799-SAFE or visit www.thehotline.org. The advantage of this website is that if you double-click escape, it takes you to a Google homepage, which will mean you can hide what you're doing if you're disturbed by your abuser. The link to both websites will be in the description. However, if you or someone you know is in immediate danger, then do not hesitate to call 999 or 911 or whatever the emergency service number is in your country. In 2014, Breck Bednar was a 14-year-old schoolboy, and like many children his age, he spent time online gaming and chatting to his friends. Unfortunately, he was targeted and groomed by 18-year-old Lewis Daines, an extremely disturbed and dangerous man who murdered Breck. He then tried to cover his tracks by making the following call to the police.
Essex Police Emergency.
Hi there. Okay. Hello. I need police and a forensics team to my address, please.
What do you mean? What's happened?
My friend and I got into an altercation, and I'm the only one who came out alive.
Breck Bednar was born in London on March 17, 1999, to Lauren and Barry. By 2006, Breck's parents had divorced, and he lived with his mother and his three younger siblings, 12-year-old triplets Carly, Chloe, and Sebastian. He was a student at St Bede's School in Red Hill in Surrey in the UK, and a member of the Air Training Corps 135 Squadron, also in Red Hill, and was described by those who knew him as a polite, warm and compassionate young man. However, Breck struggled to make friends, and, like many children, he spent his time online gaming, forming connections with those he met online. In mid-2013, Breck was introduced to an online gaming group by a friend at church, and this group was run by Lewis Daines, an 18-year-old man who lived in Grays in Essex. There were only 8 members of this online group in total, and Daines was in control, with him banning members of the group at will, and the group communicated via headphones. Daines would boast to the group about his success as a software engineer. He claimed to live in New York, own various properties, and work for the government on top-secret projects. He also told them he had donated $2.5 million in Bitcoin to rebels fighting the government forces in Syria. Daines claimed to be a millionaire, the owner of several companies that were valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Daines would make these claims to all the members of the group, but it appears that as time progressed, he began to hone in on Breck, grooming him. Breck clearly loved the attention, believing that a wealthy tech entrepreneur was interested in him. He did not see the danger that he was in, or realize that the person he was talking to was extremely dangerous and a master manipulator. Lewis Daines was born in 1986, and it's reported that he had a troubled life. He was an only child and his parents divorced when he was young. After the separation, Daines' mother left the country and he spent time living with his grandmother and, it's also reported, spent some time in the care system. At the age of 16, so in around 2012, Daines moved into a property owned by his grandparents. Daines was described as a recluse by his neighbours, who barely saw him, with him spending almost all of his time sat in front of his computer gaming. It does appear that Daines had some skill with software engineering, although I cannot find out whether he had qualifications or whether he was simply self-taught. However, he was not a millionaire, did not own any companies, and was clearly a manipulative and narcissistic man who made up lies of extreme wealth and success in order to gain attention, with his stories being in contrast to his real existence, where he was unemployed and living rent-free in his grandparents' house. Daines also had a sexual interest in young boys and had already come to the attention of the police. This included in 2011, when he was arrested by the police on suspicion of 5 offences, including attempted rape, sexual activity without consent, as well as child pornography. This occurred when he was 15 years old, when he attempted to rape another boy. However, this was apparently investigated by Essex police, but he was not charged with any offences. It appears that Daines had set upon using gaming to identify and groom male children for sexual purposes, and in 2013, he had set his sights on Breck Bednar. Breck was clearly taken with the attention of Lewis Daines, a man who was telling him that he too could become a successful software engineer and a millionaire like him because he had, quote, that kind of mind. Daines told Breck that he was wasting his time with school and that they should go into business together. Daines used his power to block people online to isolate Breck, with him blocking his friends and especially those who tried to call him out on his lies. Daines would also get into Breck's head by telling him that his friends were talking about him behind his back and that he was the only one that he could trust. Lauren began to notice a change in her son's behaviour. He stopped going to church and socialising outside of his bedroom and would spend most of his time in front of the computer. She became concerned by the influence Daines was having on Breck, with him frequently telling her all the lies that Daines had told him about his wealth and success, which she was able to see through. Lauren tried to stop contact between Daines and Breck by threatening to take away his computer, but Daines would twist this into Breck's parents trying to control him rather than protect him. Daines convinced Breck that his parents and friends were just jealous and that he was the only one that he could trust and the only one who could see his true potential. During arguments with his mother, Breck would tell his mother, while Lewis said this or that, and she was becoming increasingly concerned that he was grooming her son. Daines was clearly a skilled manipulator and was using classic grooming techniques, including establishing a bond with his victim, filling some sort of need in their life, making them feel special and unique, as well as isolating them from others. In December 2013, Breck's mother Lauren called Essex police, stating that her son was being groomed and she believed he was in danger. The police took no action. She did attempt to end the online relationship between Breck and Daines, but was unable to control everything her son was doing. She limited his access to electronic devices and added parental controls to lessen his contact with Daines. However, Daines would help Breck circumvent all of these barriers and encourage him to lie to his parents to remain in control of him. In early 2014, Daines began to put the next stage of his plan into action, meeting Breck. Daines told Breck that he was dying and wanted to hand over his business to him. However, they needed to meet face to face at his property in Grays, Essex, so he could show Breck the ropes before the handover. They arranged a meeting on the 17th of February 2014. What happened on the 17th of February 2014 at Lewis Daines' property in Grays, Essex was clearly pre-planned, as in the weeks leading up to this date, he bought duct tape, condoms, syringes and cable ties. On the directions of Daines, Breck told his mother that he was going to stay at a friend's house for a sleepover near their home in Surrey, but he secretly took a train to Grays in Essex, and after taking a taxi to Daines' property, stepped through the front door. What happened next will never be known with certainty, but it appears that soon after arriving, Daines attacked Breck and tied him up. Police determined that sexual activity had taken place between the pair, but, understandably, they'd never disclosed exactly what occurred. But I believe that this was likely non-consensual. Danes then cut Breck's throat with this knife, causing cataclysmic injuries, resulting in him bleeding to death in minutes. Danes then calmly took a shower and, shockingly, took pictures of Breck's dead body and shared them online with people, clearly to gain more attention. He took the bloody clothes he was wearing and put them in a rubbish bag. He also dumped his hard drives in water, clearly to erase the contents. And then, only then, he made the 999 call, which I partially played during the intro. But here is a fuller version of that call.
Essex Police Emergency.
Hi there. Okay. Hello. I need police and a forensics team to my address, please.
What do you mean? What's happened?
My friend and I got into an altercation, and I'm the only one who came out alive.
Are you telling me you've killed somebody?
Yes, I am.
Right, and who am I speaking to?
My name is Lewis Danes. I'm 18 years old, and I live...
Right, okay. And what's actually happened?
My friend came to stay the night with me yesterday, feeling very down, feeling suicidal. And I woke up this morning, he was in a mess. I tried to calm him down. I hugged him, then said that I was there for him. He shrugged me off.
Can you just bear with me a second? Don't tell me any more, okay?
Okay.
You're telling me he is definitely dead?
Yes, I'm telling you he's definitely dead.
Bear with me a second. Right, okay, Lewis, I need you to just take me back through that again. So what happened last night?
Okay. He came to stay with me because he was feeling down. I tried
What's
my
his
best.
name?
Breck. B-R-E-C-K. Bednar. B-E-D-N-E-R.
Sorry, B-R-E...
E-C-K.
Breck?
Yes.
And then his surname is?
Bednar. B-E-D-N-E-R.
Okay, so he came to stay with you.
I can explain this to the officers when they
I
get
will
there.
just, I need to take these initial details.
I know. He came to stay with me the night. I did my best to comfort him. I woke up this morning. He was in a mess. I tried again.
Right, just slow down again, Lewis. I need to take these details. So did you have an argument with him last night?
No, we were fine.
You were fighting?
No, we were fine. We were fine last night. We both went to sleep. I said that we were fine.
Okay, but why did he come to stay with you?
Because he was fed up with his home life.
Right, because he was fed up with his home life.
He's had a lot of problems. I've known him for a long time. He came to stay with me. I was in Thailand last week on holiday. He was in Spain on holiday.
Right, okay.
We both got back.
So,
met up.
you both went to bed, and then what's happened this morning?
I woke up. He was just standing up. He was in a mess, hands on his face. I got up. I put my arms around him, and I said it was okay. He just shrugged me off and said no. I can't remember exactly what he said. He was going on about how he didn't want to go home. He was fed up with his life, and he didn't want to go.
Right,
and
okay.
I have a penknife on the side of, in my room, adjacent to my bed. I have a chest of drawers. After shaving the TV and stuff on there, I had a penknife on there, folded. He picked it up, opened it, and then lost control.
Slow down. Let me just take those details. He had penknife on the bedside table. Brett grabbed this.
Yes.
What, in order to harm himself?
No, in order to harm me. He opened it and then lost control.
To harm informant and opened it. It states he lost control.
In self-defense, put my left arm up to block him from stabbing me effectively. We struggled. I got him to the ground. He got up. I got the knife. Can you not interrupt me with this part?
Okay, go on.
Okay. This is being recorded anyway, isn't it?
Yep.
I grabbed the knife and I stabbed him once in the back of the neck, I believe somewhere near the brainstem. He turned around, tried to carry it on, and I think I stumbled on my chest of drawers. I fell over. I got back up, backed away, and then I don't remember exactly what happened, but the fight ended with me cutting his throat. I believe I turned around and I slashed his throat.
Right.
He fell face first on my bed. I tried to stop the bleeding.
Yep.
He fell onto the floor.
Yep.
I couldn't stop it. His throat was properly cut.
And he's still on the floor?
Yes. He fell onto the bed face first. I was trying to compress the wound at that time. And
Lewis, are you still in the room where Breck is?
No.
Where are you?
Look, don't interrupt me. Just let me explain this. If this is being recorded, I didn't know what to do. I felt like.
Right, is the house where you are is where you are and where Breck is, yeah? But you're in another room, are you?
Yes, I felt like taking my own life. I don't remember what happened after that. All I know is I dropped the knife in my hallway. I stripped down and just sat in the shower.
Right, you've left the weapon in the hallway.
Yes.
And have spent how long sitting in the shower?
I don't know. Look, are the police on their way? I can hear something.
They are.
Okay, I'm going to go and do my part. Please, thank you for your help.
Right, just listen.
Clearly, Lewis Daines is a narcissist, believing that he was smarter than the police and that his story would be believed without any questions being asked. But it's clear that alarm bells were ringing the second he started speaking on this call. I don't know about you, but if I killed a friend, even by accident, I'd be in an absolute state and probably couldn't string two words together. I definitely wouldn't sound like I was calling to order a pizza or book a taxi. The lack of emotion in this call by a man who's standing with the dead body of a 14-year-old boy that he just murdered at his feet is shocking, and I think highlights the evil of Lewis Daines. It's absolutely chilling. As well as the phone call, the police clearly found it strange that Daines had taken time to clean himself, destroy evidence, post pictures of Breck's body before calling them. It seems that Daines tried to change his story several times, claiming that Breck had tried to stab him and he'd killed him in self-defense, to then claiming that Breck had tried to kill himself with the knife, and when Daines tried to stop him, his throat was cut, apparently by accident. However, none of this was believed, and the evidence did not stack up. Breck had clearly been bound, and there was no evidence of any altercation between the pair. Lewis Daines was charged with murder. Clearly knowing that the case was airtight, Lewis Daines pleaded guilty to the murder of Breck Bednar and was set to be sentenced at Chelmsford Crown Court on the 12th of January 2015 before Mrs. Justice Cox. Daines attended his sentencing hearing wearing a suit and showing no emotion during the hearing and keeping his head down. The only movement from him was him shaking his head when details of the case were read out, which he disagreed with. Specifically, the implication that the murder of Breck was underpinned by a sexual and sadistic motivation. Justice Cox stated, quote, "Having lured the young victim to your flat, you murdered him. You had befriended Breck with a number of other adolescent friends through an online community. Your contact with Breck increased in a sinister way. The precise details of what happened in your flat are unclear and may never be known. I'm sure this murder was driven by sadistic or sexual motivation." She then sentenced him. Lewis Daines was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years before he can apply for parole. Before analysing Lewis Danes, it's necessary to outline his further behaviour after his imprisonment. Specifically, on the 26th of November 2015, so 10 months after his sentence, 2 blog posts appeared online entitled, quote, BBC documentary, questions to be asked, and, quote, open letter from Lewis Danes. Both reported to have been written and posted by Danes himself. They are sickening postings, and it's clear that the main purpose is to cause further harm to the family whilst continuing to minimise his behaviour. I won't read either out completely, but read out parts and comment on these. So the second post starts with, quote, the purpose of this statement is not intended to cause further distress to the family and friends of Breck. It is to put forward additional details unknown to the general public who did not know Breck or me. I have waited and respected the need for the family and friends of Breck to take full advantage of the media coverage and feel it's now time to release my own statement. Take full advantage of the media coverage. Their son was murdered. This is not media coverage that anyone in Breck's life wanted. And what right do you have to respond? The way this is worded is like a petulant child not getting attention, basically saying, why are you paying so much attention to them? What about me? There's then lots of rambling basically stating that he's not a predatory sex offender against children. But then it becomes more sinister, with Danes stating, quote, Breck was driven away from family life and towards the virtual world. He drew comfort from the friends he made online. Our community members and myself learned that Breck suffered severe abuse at home. Abuse from someone who was supposed to nurture him and care for him. Someone who's supposed to encourage him and support him in his hopes and dreams and in the career path that he had chosen. A career path he shared with us, his online friends, who would listen and try giving advice on how to deal with the abuse. We learned, and some of us witnessed and recorded, that abusive individual regularly coming home in a state of intoxication and letting fly with drunken, abusive behaviour at Breck, shouting and humiliating him, often turning violent, causing Breck to withdraw further into that virtual safe haven that he found online. This he shared with other members and myself. His abuser is well known to police. Various people have previously filed reports of child abuse and domestic violence with the police, which are on record and easily verifiable. He then adds, quote, on reflection, I believe this is why he formed this strong emotional attachment to me. He obviously drew some kind of comfort in having others and myself to confide in, to talk about his domestic problems and abuse. Someone who encouraged him and tried to help him deal with the abuse and mixed up feelings, trying to advise him to try to choose his own path and not be coerced into careers and fundamental religious beliefs he did not believe in or want to follow. So, Breck was being abused and Danes was there to comfort him. His family drove him online, so basically they, not he, are ultimately responsible for his death. To be clear, there's no evidence of abuse, and even if there was, how does this justify what he did? Curiously, Danes says he won't name the alleged abusers, likely because they don't exist. Danes can't help continuing to lie about his success, with him claiming that, just prior to murdering Breck, he'd been offered a job abroad and had just returned from a successful business trip. Danes appears to generally feel aggrieved with any implication in the media that his life was not perfect, including the state of his flat, with him responding to reports that it was described as untidy by saying, quote, the police photographs actually show a very clean, tidy, modern flat inside and outside in a very nice residential street, the opposite of what they describe it as. Sickeningly, this second blog post ends with the lines, quote, Breck, you'll always be in my thoughts. I hope you're at peace. I am so sorry. Your friend, Lewis Danes. It appears likely that these posts were actually written by Danes, and either he posted them himself, using a mobile phone he obtained in prison, or potentially he dictated it to some weak-minded individual on the outside, who then posted it on his behalf. However, regardless of how it got there, it gives us further information to understand the evil that is Lewis Danes. Of course, we can only speculate, but I believe that he's likely what is known as a malignant narcissist. This is a subcategory of narcissistic personality disorder, which basically involves the sufferer being self-absorbed, having low empathy for others, and expecting special treatment from others due to their apparent superiority. However, this is often a mask, as sufferers usually have extreme issues with their self-esteem and such a fragile ego that they project to others the person they want to be as a way to desperately hide from the person they truly are. Malignant narcissism is considered a severe form of this condition, with sufferers displaying traits of often extremely abusive behavior, victimizing others in order to get what they want. Traits of a malignant narcissist include being preoccupied with fantasies about beauty, brilliance, success, and power, having an inability to handle criticism, being likely to take advantage of others to get what they want, having a lack of empathy for others, having no remorse for hurting others and no interest in apologizing unless it benefits them, and having a tendency to blame others for their own bad behavior. These individuals are practiced liars and manipulators, and will spin the most amazing tales of success, even if they're clearly lies. And, when confronted, they'll refuse to admit any fault and twist the narratives to make themselves seem like the victim. I think, based on these traits, it's easy to see why I think Lewis Daines fits into this category. He is a man who demanded special treatment from others and felt entitled to engage in sex acts with young boys, and would manipulate and coerce anyone to get his own way. His coldness after killing Breck on the phone call to 999, I think, shows his complete lack of any emotion or empathy. He knew that society would frown on his behaviour, but I think he struggles to understand what the issue is. Hence why he felt the need to comment about the media's portrayal of him. His sole focus is on how others see him. He can't get away from the fact he killed Breck, but of course it's everyone else's fault. It's Breck's family's fault for alleged abuse, and he was actually Breck's protector and his friend. His ego is so fragile that he even had to write about the fact that his flat was clean and tidy, and continued to lie about how successful he was. Personality disorders are lifelong conditions, with sufferers engaging with therapy to manage the traits of their condition. However, narcissists do not tend to seek out or accept treatment, as it would involve acknowledging their issues, letting the mask slip. It may be that Lewis Daines has a revelation in years to come, and shows genuine remorse, and tries to make amends for his behaviour, but I doubt it. I'm not sure he has the capacity to feel remorse, or any other emotion for anyone but himself. Lewis Daines is a monster, and I think will continue to pose a serious risk of harm to others until the day that he leaves this world. The death of Breck destroyed his family's life, and Lauren has been transparent about her struggles to come to terms with the death of her son and best friend, with her explaining that she basically couldn't get out of bed for a year after his death. However, as with many of my videos, it's amazing how brave these people are and how someone keeps going when they've suffered the most horrific of losses. A parent should never have to bury their child. Her heartache must have been compounded when she found out about the blog posts I just mentioned. The family did try to get them taken down, but was stonewalled, with them being told they needed to speak to Daines about removing them. I mean, seriously. Unfortunately, they still exist today. I won't link to them. They don't deserve any attention. Her heart must have further sunk when the Independent Police Complaints Commission cleared Essex Police of any wrongdoing in their handling of this case, specifically not acting on Lauren's call to them in December 2013. Lauren then set up the Breck Foundation, the link to which I'll put in the description. It's a really interesting website where you can volunteer or fundraise for the organisation and book a speaker to come to schools or churches to talk to children about internet safety. They also provide training for teachers on how to spot the signs of grooming. You can also donate, which I think, if you're looking for a cause to support, this would be a perfect organisation because the whole focus of them is to protect children, And, as the stats say on the website, 99% of children went online in some form in 2021, and a third of children regularly play online games with strangers. I've signed up for a monthly donation, and there are various categories telling you what your donation can achieve. I have no affiliation with this foundation, and I'm just mentioning it genuinely because I think that organisations like this should be handed bags of money to continue their work, as it's clear not only that this foundation keeps Breck's memory alive, but his mother's sole focus now is to try and stop other mothers having to go through the agony that she had to go through. Breck, I'm sure, will be proud of her, and I sincerely hope that he is at peace.